the shadows of Harlem's streets, Frank Lucas built an empire from the very thing that tore lives apart. But when the lights faded and the empire crumbled, the question remained, was he a hero who fought for his family, or a villain consumed by his own ambitions? Frank Lucas was born into the kind of world that makes a man ask if there's a way out. North Carolina, in the 1940s, was full of hard work and harder lives. His father was long gone, leaving Frank and his mother to scrape by in a place where dirt roads and the constant hum of crickets were the soundtrack of survival. The home was small, the meals were sparse, and there was little beyond the struggle to keep breathing. There were lessons in the air he breathed, even if they weren't always spoken. From his mother, Frank learned the art of perseverance. She worked the land, tended to others' needs, and made do with whatever scraps came her way. But in the absence of his father, Frank was hungry for something more. He was a boy with a fire in his belly, always watching, always taking mental notes. The men in his life, his uncles, his neighbors, taught him survival wasn't just about labor, but about leverage. The difference between someone who scrapes by and someone who owns the dirt they walk on was a matter of knowing how to make the world bend to your will. Ambition simmered beneath Frank's stoic exterior. As a child, he didn't want to just survive, he wanted to escape. He would sit on the porch, looking out at the distant hills, and dream of places beyond the patchwork of farmland and dilapidated houses. He wanted more than this place could offer. He wanted power, respect, a life where the only thing that counted was what he could build with his own two hands. The idea that one could transcend the muck, rise from nothing, Frank clung to it like a promise. It was a fight he couldn't win by staying in that small town, playing by the same rules everyone else did. Something happened when he was just a boy, an event that burned itself into his memory and hardened the man he would eventually become. One summer, when Frank was about 12, he witnessed a man get beaten by the local sheriff. The man wasn't a saint, but the cruelty of the sheriff, someone who was supposed to uphold the law, struck Frank in a way he'd never forget. It wasn't just the violence, it was the injustice of it all. The powerless being crushed by those who had the means to do so. Frank knew then that to survive, you needed more than strength. You needed power, and you had to take it. That moment cracked something wide open in him. It sparked an ambition that would burn for the rest of his life. It wasn't enough to endure poverty or to survive abuse. Frank had to escape, to become something the world couldn't crush. He began to dream of bigger cities, of bigger opportunities. One way or another, Frank Lucas was going to leave that small town behind. His road would be long and filled with dark turns, but it would be his own. And it would start with one very simple but powerful thing: the will to get out. Frank Lucas stepped off the bus into the roar of Harlem with a mix of hope and hunger in his chest. The streets pulsed with life in a way he had never imagined. The buildings towered, the air was thick with the sounds of music, conversations, and the quick shuffle of feet, everything moving faster, bigger, louder than the quiet, sun-baked hills of North Carolina. Harlem, in the 1950s, was a kingdom of its own, where the dreams were as big as the struggles that came with them. At first, Frank was just a wide-eyed country boy trying to make his mark in a place that didn't have the time to wait for him to catch up. He knew the city was a jungle, but he hadn't yet learned that the lions didn't wear fur. They wore suits, or gold chains, or nothing at all. He started small, like most who arrive with little more than the clothes on their back. He picked up odd jobs, shining shoes, carrying bags, anything to earn $1. But every time he took a step, the city swallowed it up, offering nothing in return except more noise, more competition, more hunger. The streets of Harlem were a battlefield. Frank had seen men fight in the fields back home, but this was something different. There were no clean lines here, no rules you could trust. People fought with everything they had, but they fought in silence, under cover of darkness. It was here that Frank started to see the true power of the streets. The currency wasn't just money, it was respect. The men who had power, who ran the blocks, were the ones who understood that respect could be traded like anything else. It was a lesson Frank learned quickly. He watched the hustlers, the dealers, the men who moved in and out of the shadows. They made it look easy, but Frank knew better than to think it was. There was a dangerous rhythm to it all, a flow of life and death that moved in waves, unpredictable and violent. Frank's first hustle was simple. He learned how to move product, a little stolen good here, a bit of something else there. He started small, building his network, learning the rules of the game. It wasn't long before he realized that the men at the top didn't deal in scraps. They dealt in the real money, the things that everyone wanted, but no one dared to touch. But Frank wasn't intimidated. He was patient. Harlem's underworld taught him that patience was key. The city wasn't a place where you earned respect overnight, and Frank had learned, back in North Carolina, that waiting for the right moment could sometimes be the most powerful move of all. Soon, Frank wasn't just hustling for others, he was hustling for himself. He started to climb, slowly at first, testing the waters, learning the nuances of Harlem's criminal empire. Every mistake was a lesson. Every small victory, a step forward. The city was brutal, but it was also full of opportunity. Frank had learned how to find it, how to survive in it, and how to make it work for him. Frank had only been in Harlem a few months when he met Freddie, a small-time dealer who ran a modest operation out of a rundown apartment on the corner of 125th Street. Freddie wasn't a big shot by any means, but he knew the pulse of the streets, the rhythm that dictated who lived and who died in the game. He saw something in Frank, an energy, a quiet hunger, and offered him a chance to work. At first, Frank just ran errands. He picked up packages, moved merchandise, handled cash. Simple work, but it was enough to get a feel for the streets, enough to see how the game worked at its most basic level. It didn't take long before Frank's ambition outgrew the role of a messenger. He watched Freddie closely, studied the way he moved, the way he talked, the way he handled people. It was all a dance, a performance. Freddie had a network of people, hustlers, junkies, small-time dealers, and each had their place in the operation. Frank learned quickly that it wasn't just about selling a product. It was about controlling the flow, managing the trust of the people around you. Every deal was a risk, but the men who succeeded understood how to navigate those risks, how to build relationships that could hold under pressure. As Frank became more involved in the business, he started to understand the mechanics of it all, the weight of the heroin, the purity, the money involved. He learned the importance of trust in this world, the way you had to measure every person you dealt with, understand who was loyal and who was a liability. In the drug trade, one wrong move could cost you everything, but if you played your cards right, it could be the key to everything you'd ever wanted. Frank was learning fast. He was moving up, inch by inch, watching as Freddie made connections, carved out his territory, and built a reputation. But Frank had bigger plans. He knew that Freddie's hustle, though steady, wasn't the path to the kind of power he wanted. He was starting to see the bigger picture, the men at the top, the ones who controlled the supply, the ones who made the real money. Frank wasn't interested in being a small player forever. He was determined to rise above the petty hustles, the street corner deals, and carve his own name into the game. The streets had a way of breaking people, but Frank was beginning to feel something else. A sharpened sense, a kind of instinct that made him see the world differently. He knew when to step back, when to push forward, when to keep his mouth shut and when to speak. His street sense was growing, and it was becoming clear that Frank wasn't just a hustler, he was becoming someone who could run the game. And that hunger, that ambition, was the thing that would drive him from the bottom to the top. Frank had never been content with being a cog in someone else's machine. He'd watched long enough, learned enough, and now it was his turn to take control. His small-time hustle was beginning to feel like a cage, and he wanted out. It wasn't enough to just move merchandise. He wanted to own the whole block, run the entire supply chain, and make his own rules. So, Frank started laying the groundwork for his own operation, quietly at first, testing the waters, making connections, and watching the weak spots in the market. It wasn't long before he had his own team, runners, lieutenants, drivers, each one loyal to him, either by choice or necessity. Frank understood the value of loyalty in this business, the kind of loyalty that could be bought, but also earned. His reputation grew quickly, and before long, street-level dealers were lining up, eager to work with him. They'd heard the whispers. Frank Lucas wasn't just another hustler. He was someone you didn't want to cross. The money flowed smoothly through his network, and the blocks of Harlem began to feel like his personal empire. But running the streets wasn't just about muscle, it was about strategy. Frank studied his competition closely. He knew that every rival had a weakness, and it wasn't always in the drugs they sold, but in how they ran their business. The men who competed with him on the street level were too reckless, too loud. They made enemies too quickly, wasted their product, and took their trust for granted. Frank was different. He wasn't just selling heroin, he was selling an idea. He understood the value of discretion, of making the right deal at the right time. He built relationships with suppliers who could get him the best product, and he created a network that ran deep both in Harlem and beyond. He kept his operations quiet, his hands clean, and his eyes always open. But the higher Frank climbed, the more eyes were on him. Rival dealers didn't like losing their territories, and law enforcement was beginning to notice the power shift. Frank wasn't some small-time hustler anymore. He was a kingpin, and with that title came more enemies than he had ever imagined. Police raids, snitches, rival cartels. He had to outthink them all. He began paying off law enforcement, moving product through decoys, using his trusted allies to cover his tracks. Every move was calculated. He learned how to hide in plain sight, how to stay a step ahead. But with every victory, the weight of his position grew heavier. The threats weren't just from the streets anymore, they were coming from all sides, from every direction. Frank was no longer just playing for survival. He was playing for dominance. Despite the growing pressure, Frank thrived. His reputation spread like wildfire across the streets, and soon, every dealer in Harlem knew that crossing Frank Lucas was a mistake they wouldn't live to make twice. He wasn't just respected, he was feared. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Every kingpin had to fight to keep their throne, and Frank's enemies were closing in. Frank had always known that to get to the top, you couldn't just play by the old rules. Harlem's drug game had its established players, the mafia, the other street bosses, but Frank saw an opportunity to bypass the middlemen and take control of the flow. The mafia had their hands in everything, and while they were powerful, they were also slow and too entrenched in their ways. Frank was looking for something faster, something more direct, a way to cut out the fat and get to the source. He started making connections in Southeast Asia, where the heroin was coming from, and before long, he had established a deal with the suppliers that put him in charge of his own product. He called it Blue Magic, a brand that would soon become synonymous with purity, power, and dominance. Frank was meticulous about his product. He wasn't just selling heroin, he was selling a reputation. The heroin he sourced was some of the purest on the streets, and he made sure that when it hit Harlem, it stood out. Blue Magic was the real deal, and word spread quickly. Dealers who had once worked for the mafia now came to Frank. He offered them something they couldn't refuse, a better product, a better price, and the chance to get in on something bigger. Harlem became his kingdom, and Blue Magic was the crown jewel. But building an empire meant more than just good product. It meant controlling logistics, managing the flow of drugs and money in a way that was nearly impossible to trace. Frank was obsessed with secrecy. Every part of his operation was hidden behind layers of people, and every transaction was made through intermediaries who had no idea who was at the top. He ran his operation like a well-oiled machine, every part working in perfect harmony. He had his own network of trusted men in every position, from the couriers who moved the drugs to the ones who handled the money. Frank made sure his empire was decentralized, making it harder for law enforcement to connect the dots. His operation wasn't just large, it was invisible. With blue magic dominating Harlem's streets, the money came in faster than Frank could count it. He didn't just buy mansions and cars, he reinvested his wealth into expanding his empire. His name was becoming known not just on the streets, but in higher places as well. He wasn't just a street hustler anymore, he was a businessman. He played the game on his terms, and for the first time, he felt like the world was his to take. But with power came enemies, and Frank knew that he couldn't let his guard down. The rewards were great, but so were the risks. Every day, someone was trying to take him down, to knock him off his throne. Still, Frank didn't care. He was a king, and nothing, not even the mafia, could stop him now. Frank's country boy persona wasn't just an act, it was his weapon. Coming from rural North Carolina, Frank understood how to blend into the background and let people underestimate him. It was a power in disguise, a shield behind which he could operate without drawing attention. People saw him as humble, even simple. They didn't see the calculating mind beneath the rough exterior, and that was just the way he liked it. In a world full of egos and flashy displays of power, Frank knew that staying under the radar was his greatest advantage. His demeanor was unassuming, even disarming, which made it easier for him to navigate the complex world of drug dealing. He wasn't the loudmouth on the corner, or the man flashing cash at every turn. He didn't need to be. His reputation for quiet efficiency spoke louder than any bragging ever could. His rural upbringing played a bigger role in his success than anyone could have guessed. It had taught him discipline, patience, and attention to detail, traits that were invaluable in the drug trade. He didn't get impatient when things took time to fall into place. Frank knew that every piece of his empire had to be positioned just right, and he was willing to wait as long as it took for everything to fall into place. His methodical approach allowed him to control every aspect of his heroin business, from the quality of the product to the distribution channels, with a precision few others could match. In a world where rash decisions and quick profits often led to failure, Frank's calm and calculated demeanor made him nearly untouchable. His patience wasn't just about the business, it was a reflection of his character, a product of years of navigating a world that valued survival over speed. While his competition flashed their wealth and tried to build their empire through intimidation, Frank focused on the long game. He didn't need the spotlight. He was content to let his heroin flow through Harlem like a silent river, his reach extending further than anyone could see. His ability to stay out of the limelight while controlling one of the most profitable heroin empires in the city was a testament to his mastery of secrecy. He surrounded himself with loyal men, each one playing a vital role in his operation, but none of them were ever in a position to see the full picture. He kept the strings of his empire tight, never letting anyone get too close to the core of his operation. This was his strength. His enemies never saw him coming. Frank wasn't a man who ruled through fear. Instead, he built relationships through trust and respect. He understood that loyalty couldn't be bought with violence alone. He knew how to make people feel like they mattered, and in a world full of cutthroat deals and shifting alliances, that made all the difference. His charm wasn't the flashy kind, it was subtle, rooted in genuine care for the people around him. Frank didn't need to threaten his way to the top. His quiet power was enough to keep people loyal, and in the end, that was what kept his empire intact. Frank had always known that quality was key, and with blue magic, he proved that point to the world. The purity of his heroin was unmatched, and it quickly became the product of choice for dealers all across Harlem. Frank didn't just sell a drug, he sold a brand, and it became synonymous with reliability and potency. He kept a tight grip on every aspect of production, ensuring that each batch that left his warehouses was as close to perfection as possible. The consistency of Blue Magic was what set it apart. While other dealers might cut corners or dilute their product to increase profits, Frank held fast to his principle. Blue Magic had to be the best, or there was no point in doing it at all. The secretive channels Frank set up for distribution were the lifeblood of his empire. He didn't just rely on a single method to move his product. Blue Magic's success was rooted in Frank's meticulous network of couriers, safe houses, and middlemen. Everything was compartmentalized to ensure that no one person knew the full extent of the operation. Frank took steps to ensure that each part of the process, from manufacturing to delivery, was guarded by layers of loyalty and secrecy. He moved his heroin with such precision that law enforcement had no way to track it down. Every move was calculated, every shipment disguised. Blue Magic didn't just flow through Harlem. It flowed through the streets of New York, like a well-hidden artery, running beneath the surface, always out of sight. When the time was right, Frank expanded beyond Harlem. He made the calculated decision to push Blue Magic into other East Coast cities, testing the waters in places like Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington, D.C. It wasn't an impulsive move. Frank had been planning it for months, laying down the groundwork with trusted men in each city. He knew that to grow, he had to take the product to a larger audience. The heroin game in Harlem had reached its peak, but there were other cities hungry for his brand, and Frank wasn't about to leave money on the table. The East Coast cities became extensions of his empire, each one feeding off the success of the original operation. But success, as always, came with its consequences. As Blue Magic grew, so did attention from law enforcement. Frank had done his best to stay out of the limelight, but his empire was impossible to ignore. The DEA began tightening their grip on the East Coast, looking for any crack to exploit. Meanwhile, the Mafia, who had once controlled much of the heroin market, started to take notice of Frank's success. They were used to being at the top, and they didn't take kindly to a newcomer who was carving out a piece of their territory. Frank knew that his success had made him a target, but he also understood that power came at a price. The more Blue Magic grew, the more vulnerable he became. Yet, in that vulnerability, Frank remained calm. He had always thrived under pressure. The tension between Frank and the Mafia began to build slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. For a long time, Frank had managed to operate in the shadows, carving out his slice of the drug trade without attracting too much attention from the established power players in New York's criminal world. But as Blue Magic's reach expanded and his success became undeniable, the Mafia, particularly the Italians, started to notice. They were used to controlling the flow of heroin in the city, and someone like Frank Lucas, a black man from North Carolina, running a successful heroin operation, was a threat to everything they had built. They didn't take too kindly to competition. Their first attempts to take control of Frank's operation were subtle, a few phone calls, quiet threats. Frank, however, wasn't easily intimidated. He knew how to play the game, and he understood that in the criminal world, you either took control or you became a casualty. The Mafia's attempts to sway him with bribes, offers of partnership, and even intimidation were met with nothing but resistance. Frank refused to bend to their will. He had built his empire from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him, not even the most powerful crime syndicate in the world. It was a clash of cultures. Frank's disciplined, business-like approach to the heroin trade against the Mafia's chaotic, violent methods. Frank ran his operation like a corporation, with careful logistics, tight security, and an unwavering focus on maintaining the highest quality product. The Mafia, on the other hand, relied on fear, violence, and unpredictable actions. Their methods were messy, reckless, and often involved making a spectacle out of their dealings. They had the muscle, but Frank had the brains, and while their intimidation tactics could work on others, Frank didn't scare easily. The more the mafia tried to undermine him, the more resolute Frank became. He knew he couldn't back down, not now, not after everything he had built. He understood that this was the price of success, and if it meant going toe-to-toe with the mafia, then so be it. Frank wasn't just fighting for power, he was fighting for respect, both in the streets and within the criminal world. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not even for a moment. The rivalry with the mafia had a profound impact on Frank's empire. His operations became more dangerous, more secretive. He had to be more cautious, always watching his back. Yet, it also solidified his reputation as a man who couldn't be pushed around. Frank was no longer just a player in the drug game, he was a force to be reckoned with. And in the eyes of the streets, he had earned his place at the top. Frank's decision to involve his family in the heroin business was a move rooted in practicality and loyalty. From the beginning, he understood that in the drug trade, trust was the most valuable currency. And trust was something Frank could only find in his family. They had been through the toughest times together, and their bond was unbreakable. The streets were filled with betrayal and deceit, but with family, Frank knew loyalty was guaranteed. He wasn't just building a criminal empire, he was building a legacy, and he wanted his blood to carry it forward. His wife, son, and cousins all played pivotal roles in the operation. His wife, though largely kept out of the spotlight, was instrumental in managing the day-to-day logistics. She was the steady hand that helped Frank keep his empire running smoothly, ensuring that things didn't fall apart while he dealt with the more dangerous aspects of the business. His son, although young, was groomed for the future, watching closely, learning how to keep the operation intact. Frank had always made it clear that family came first, and he wanted to make sure they understood the importance of keeping their business tight-knit. But Frank's extended family also had their roles to play. His cousins worked as couriers, drivers, and middlemen, carrying out tasks that required a level of trust that few other people could offer. They were Frank's eyes and ears, ensuring that his operation moved without disruption. They lived and worked in the shadows, always in close proximity, always loyal. But even with all that loyalty, Frank couldn't ignore the tension that sometimes simmered beneath the surface. Family dynamics, no matter how close-knit, were complicated. Long hours, high stakes, and the constant pressure of living under the radar took their toll. There were moments of strain, heated arguments over money, disagreements about how things should be run. Yet, Frank always managed to keep things in check, knowing that the cost of losing control in his family's ranks could lead to disaster. However, the risks of involving his family in such a dangerous world were never far from Frank's mind. The business was unforgiving, and the dangers were always lurking. The higher his empire climbed, the more exposed his loved ones became. There were nights when Frank would lie awake, not fearing for his own life, but for theirs. The tension between protecting his family and the brutal reality of the criminal world weighed on him constantly. Every time he sent one of his cousins out on a delivery or asked his wife to handle a sensitive task, Frank understood the risk. He was not just gambling with his own life anymore. He was gambling with theirs. The emotional toll of intertwining his personal life with the drug trade was immense. It created a dichotomy Frank had to manage carefully. His desire to protect his family from the brutalities of the world he was entrenched in, while also ensuring their loyalty, often felt like walking a tightrope. But Frank was always willing to take that risk, because to him, the rewards were worth it. Family was everything, and in a world full of enemies, they were the only thing that could never betray him. As Frank's heroin empire expanded, so did his wealth. What had once been the struggle of a country boy from North Carolina was now a life of unimaginable luxury. His pockets, once emptied by hunger and the hardships of his rural upbringing, were now overflowing with cash. Frank didn't just dream of better things, he built them, brick by brick, until the life he had once barely imagined became his reality. The homes he owned were sprawling estates, each one more extravagant than the last. Frank's taste in real estate ran the gamut, from towering penthouses in Manhattan to sprawling villas tucked away in the quiet corners of the city. But it wasn't just the homes. His garage was a collection of the finest cars money could buy. Rolls-Royces, Cadillacs, and Porsches gleamed under the glow of perfect lighting, each car a testament to the riches he had amassed. Frank took pride in his possessions, but even more in the power that came with them. Each luxury item was a reminder of what he had built with his own hands, a silent declaration that he had risen from the dirt to stand among the elite. Clothing, too, became a part of Frank's identity. His wardrobe was no longer filled with hand-me-downs or patched-up shirts. Instead, it was filled with custom-tailored suits and expensive shoes that glimmered like jewels under the city lights. His every appearance was carefully crafted. Frank knew how to make an entrance, knew how to leave a lasting impression. Even in Harlem, where his empire had started, he walked with a different kind of swagger, the kind that came with knowing that you were untouchable. Yet, as Frank reveled in his newfound opulence, there was always the awareness that his life was a delicate balance. He worked hard to maintain a low profile, aware that the more attention he drew to himself, the greater the risk. It wasn't about avoiding the law. Frank knew he was already a target there, but about maintaining the illusion of quiet power. His homes, his cars, his wardrobe, they were all part of the image he projected. They weren't meant to boast, but to command respect. The lifestyle was as much a tool of his power as his heroin shipments or his loyal crew. The stark contrast between Frank's humble beginnings and the opulence he now enjoyed was not lost on him. He could still remember the cold nights spent in North Carolina, dreaming of a better life, but those memories had started to fade under the weight of his new life. The same hunger that had once driven him to escape the cycle of poverty had now been replaced by an insatiable desire for more power, more wealth, more respect. As Frank ascended into the ranks of the elite, he began to detach from the people he had once come from. The streets of Harlem, which had been the foundation of his rise, began to feel like a distant memory, a world he no longer belonged to. In his place was a man who walked between worlds, but didn't quite fit into either. The luxury was a mask, a way to hide the emptiness that sometimes crept in. As Frank's heroin empire grew, so did his ambition. Harlem, once the beating heart of his operation, was no longer big enough to hold the empire he had built. His eyes turned outward, seeking new territories to conquer. It wasn't long before Frank expanded beyond the familiar streets of Harlem, moving into other parts of New York and across the East Coast. The demand for his product was insatiable, and Frank was more than ready to meet it. The challenge, however, was how to keep control over an operation that was quickly outgrowing his reach. The logistics were the first hurdle. Managing a growing empire meant more than just moving heroin from point A to point B. It was about maintaining secrecy, ensuring quality, and keeping the profits flowing without drawing too much attention. Frank was meticulous. His operations had always been based on precision, and now that same attention to detail was needed on a much larger scale. He knew the importance of staying ahead of the competition, which meant diversifying his distribution channels, creating a nationwide network that stretched from New York to cities in the South and down to Florida. Each move had to be calculated, every relationship built with care. Frank also had to manage a growing army of lieutenants and trusted associates. The early days, when Frank had handled much of the business himself, were long gone. He couldn't be everywhere at once, and the scope of his empire demanded new leadership. He began to delegate, finding men who were just as loyal and ruthless as he was. These new faces helped to carry out the expansion, managing territories and ensuring that the drugs moved without delay. Frank trusted them, but he also knew that loyalty had to be earned every day, in every deal. The problems, of course, came with the growth. More territories meant more competition. As Frank's power increased, so did the number of enemies. Rival drug dealers took note of Frank's success, and many of them saw him as a threat. For the first time, Frank had to constantly look over his shoulder. The streets were more dangerous, the stakes higher. There were whispers about who was gunning for him, who was looking to take a piece of his empire. The mafia, once a thorn in his side, was now just one of many threats. Every corner of his empire was contested, from the streets of Brooklyn to the drug rings in Miami. Frank's greatest challenge was no longer just keeping the product flowing. It was about managing the ever-growing complexity of his operation, while staying one step ahead of those who wanted to take it all away. He wasn't just building a criminal empire anymore. He was building a legacy. But with that legacy came the burden of enemies, of power struggles, of the constant awareness that in the game he was playing, one mistake could cost him everything. Still, Frank pushed forward, knowing that every new territory was a victory, every new ally a stepping stone, and every risk just another part of the game he was destined to win. As Frank's empire grew, so did his desire to leave a mark on the world that went beyond the heroin trade. He was no longer just the man behind the blue magic empire. He was becoming a figure with a larger vision. While many saw him as a ruthless drug dealer, Frank saw himself as something else entirely, a modern-day Robin Hood. He viewed his work as more than just business. It was about providing for those who had nothing, giving back to the community that raised him. He wasn't just a kingpin in the streets of Harlem, he was their benefactor. And in his mind, the rewards of his fortune should be shared with the people who had helped him along the way. Frank's philanthropy became a tool to both solidify his power and build a legacy that would outlive him. He poured money into the community, funding schools, building soccer fields, and supporting local businesses in Harlem. He knew the importance of reputation and control in his world, and what better way to gain loyalty than to be the man who gave back. The community had always looked down on those who came from nothing and made it big until Frank showed them what it meant to rise up. His donations to churches, his sponsorship of sports teams, and his support for schools weren't just about doing good. They were about creating a sense of indebtedness, a loyalty from the very people he did business with. Yet, for all his charitable acts, Frank's actions remained morally complex. He was building schools and soccer fields while running a violent empire that took lives daily. It wasn't lost on him that he was simultaneously creating opportunities for kids to grow up in a better neighborhood while funding the very violence that often tore it apart. Frank could never truly escape the contradictions of his life. His empire, built on blood and money, was in constant conflict with his belief that he was doing good for the poor. He justified his actions by pointing to the wealth and opportunities he brought to his community. But deep down, Frank knew the bloodshed that made it all possible. Every soccer field, every scholarship, and every donation was paid for with a price too steep for many to see. In Frank's mind, the legacy he was building wasn't just for himself. It was for his family, his neighborhood, and the people who had been overlooked by society. He didn't just want to be remembered as the man who controlled Harlem's drug trade. He wanted to be seen as the man who, despite it all, gave back. The contrast between his violence and his philanthropy painted a picture of a man trying to reconcile two halves of his life. Frank Lucas may have ruled with fear, but he also believed in leaving something behind that could outlast the violence, a legacy not just for him, but for Harlem itself. As Frank's empire expanded, so did the shadows that hovered over him. Law enforcement was closing in, the streets were whispering of his name, and rivals were getting bolder. The DEA, FBI, and NYPD had all locked their sights on Frank, each agency determined to bring down the kingpin who had managed to operate in plain sight for so long. The pressure was relentless. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, in the way every siren seemed to echo just a little too loudly, in the way every car passing by his home now felt like a potential threat. Frank had always been a man of control, but as the noose tightened, his grip began to slip. Paranoia seeped into his daily routine. He trusted fewer people, spoke in code, and made his operation more secretive and secure. He started employing new security measures, ones he never thought he would need. Safe houses were rotated constantly. His phone calls were brief and encrypted, and he started relying on fewer intermediaries, keeping his business in-house as much as possible. Even the people closest to him, the ones who had been with him from the start, were now viewed with suspicion. In Frank's mind, loyalty was a fickle thing. He had already seen too many trusted faces turn against him. It wasn't just the law enforcement that made him nervous, it was the quiet fear of betrayal from his own people. The tension among his allies grew palpable, as whispers and side glances became the norm. No one was above suspicion, not even his closest lieutenants. Frank had built his empire on loyalty, but loyalty was a currency that could easily be spent, especially when the reward for selling him out was an escape from the impending storm. One evening, Frank narrowly avoided what could have been his undoing. He had received an anonymous tip, a warning that his location had been compromised, that the police were moving in. His heart raced as he grabbed his belongings and headed for the escape route he had meticulously planned over the years. Every step felt heavier, the walls closing in on him. He slipped out of the back door, just as a black SUV pulled up outside, its headlights cutting through the dark like a spotlight. His heart hammered in his chest as he disappeared into the night, barely escaping the trap that had been set for him. It was too close for comfort. In the days that followed, the paranoia lingered. Every moment felt like it could be his last, the fear that his world might come crumbling down growing stronger with each passing hour. His mind raced with the possibility of who might be talking to the cops, who might be feeding the authorities information, and whether the DEA was one step away from cracking his operation wide open. The lines between friend and foe began to blur, and the weight of running an empire built on secrecy, violence, and trust became a burden too heavy for Frank to carry alone. As Frank's empire grew, so did the interest of the law. The DEA, FBI, and every local police force from New York to the farthest corners of the East Coast began to circle like sharks, smelling blood in the water. It was only a matter of time before his name became synonymous with the word kingpin, and the feds weren't about to let him operate without a fight. Every move he made was scrutinized. Every corner turned was watched. The once effortless flow of his business now felt like walking a tightrope, every step taken in fear of being caught. To stay ahead of the law, Frank had to evolve. His usual street smarts, the instinctual feel for a neighborhood and its rhythms, weren't enough anymore. The government's grip was tightening, and the tools they had at their disposal, surveillance technology, wiretaps, informants, were more sophisticated than anything Frank had ever encountered. He couldn't just rely on his network of street-level dealers anymore. He needed to build layers of security, shields against the growing pressure from all sides. Bribery became his go-to solution. Frank reached out to anyone who might be willing to turn a blind eye: corrupt cops, crooked politicians, anyone with a price tag. The game of influence was nothing new to him. It was simply a new way of using power. For every cop on his payroll, for every judge that owed him a favor, Frank managed to push back the walls closing in on him. But the cost of this became apparent over time. The bribes weren't small, and as the feds' focus on him intensified, the sums grew. He was constantly dishing out money to keep the authorities off his back, a task that drained both his finances and his peace of mind. Despite his best efforts, the stress began to take a toll. Frank had never been one to show weakness, but the paranoia gnawed at him. He couldn't sleep at night without worrying about a knock on his door or a tail following him through the streets. The weight of constantly looking over his shoulder was something he hadn't anticipated when he first started building his empire. His mind, once sharp and calculating, now raced with doubts. Could he really keep this up forever? The feds were relentless, and no amount of money or favors seemed to be enough to stop them from getting closer. In quieter moments, when he was alone in his thoughts, the questions began to linger. Was it worth it? Was the empire he had built, the money, the power, worth the toll it was taking on his body and mind? For a man who had built his life on avoiding detection, on staying 2 steps ahead, the idea that he might eventually be caught became an ever-present shadow. Frank began to realize that no matter how much he tried to control his empire, he couldn't control the inevitable. Sooner or later, the law would catch up. The question was whether he could keep outrunning it, or if his time at the top was running out. Frank had always prided himself on his ability to trust few, but keep a tight grip on those around him. Loyalty, in his world, was everything. But as his empire expanded, so did the number of people involved in his operation, and with it came the inevitable risks. At first, the whispers were small, nothing more than rumors circulating in the shadows. But Frank soon realized that his world of tight-knit loyalty was beginning to fracture. Information was leaking, whispers were becoming louder, and the air around him felt thicker, more dangerous. Someone close to him was betraying him. The first sign came in the form of a routine transaction gone wrong. A shipment, one that should have gone off without a hitch, was intercepted by law enforcement. It wasn't just bad luck. Frank knew the details of his shipments better than anyone. The only explanation was that someone had tipped off the authorities. Someone who knew exactly when and where the deal was happening. The feeling of betrayal was like a knife in his gut. He had built this empire from nothing, and now, his own people were turning on him. But Frank didn't react with panic. He didn't crumble under the weight of it all. He handled it the only way he knew how, with brutal precision. The first rule in his world was that betrayal could never be tolerated. To show any weakness, to allow a traitor to walk free, was to invite the destruction of everything he had worked for. The disloyal were disposed of, quickly and without mercy. Frank's lieutenants, his trusted men, were given one warning: loyalty or death. There was no middle ground. Then came the betrayal that nearly tore his entire operation apart. A man he had considered a brother, someone who had been with him from the beginning, was the one leaking information. Frank had suspected him for a while but never acted on it until the evidence was undeniable. It was a gamble, but Frank had no choice. He set the trap, waited for the right moment, and confronted the man head-on. The confrontation was swift, the consequences brutal. Frank had always been about keeping business clean, but loyalty had to be maintained at all costs. And this man's disloyalty had to be punished with a finality that left no room for doubt. The emotional toll of these betrayals hit harder than Frank had ever expected. For a man who had built his reputation on strength and control, the idea that his own people would turn on him was a betrayal of a different kind. It wasn't just business, it was personal. He had given everything for these people, and they had given him nothing in return but betrayal. But even in the aftermath of these brutal acts, Frank's mind never stopped. He was constantly on alert, watching for the next traitor, the next leak. It was a paranoia that crept in, slow and insidious, gnawing at him every day. The fear that the next person he trusted would be the one to bring everything crashing down. In the end, it wasn't the law, nor the mafia, that Frank feared most. It was the disloyalty of the people closest to him, the very people who could destroy him from within. The pressure was mounting, relentless and suffocating. Frank had always known that his empire wouldn't go unnoticed for long. The game was too big, too profitable, and there were too many eyes watching. But nothing could have prepared him for the full weight of the DEA's pursuit. They had always been there, lurking in the background. But now they were moving in on him with the kind of intensity that made the air thick with tension. The wiretaps, the surveillance, the undercover operations, everything was closing in. Frank's every move was being watched, and for the first time in years, he couldn't control the rhythm of his world. It was a game of cat and mouse, and Frank had always been the cat. He was the one who outwitted his competitors, who stayed one step ahead of the law. But now, the stakes had changed. He could feel the heat from every direction. Law enforcement was tightening its grip. Rival dealers were circling like vultures, and the traitors within his own ranks were feeding the FBI and the DEA with just enough information to make the hunt more dangerous. Every whispered conversation felt like it could be the one that tipped the scale. Frank's world, once a controlled chaos, was starting to unravel at the seams. In his prime, he had been the man who knew everything. He had eyes and ears on every street corner, every transaction, every handshake. But now, his world was spinning out of his control. The DEA was everywhere on the phones, in the streets, in his businesses. The wiretaps were closing in, and no one was safe. Frank had always been able to rely on his network of loyal people, but now, the trust was fading. He knew that even the walls he had built couldn't protect him from the relentless reach of the government. They were going to find a way to bring him down, and he could feel it in his gut. There was one night, after a tense meeting, that Frank narrowly escaped a raid. His pulse was still pounding in his ears as he slipped out the back, his mind racing with the realization that his empire was no longer invincible. The safe houses that once felt like sanctuaries now felt like prisons. The thought of being caught, of losing everything he had worked for, gnawed at him every second. His paranoia spiked, and he became more cautious, more isolated. That night, he lay in a dark room, the weight of his own breath filling his ears, wondering how much longer he could keep this up. His empire was crumbling, and he could feel the walls closing in. He could sense the law breathing down his neck, ready to pounce at the first sign of weakness. But it wasn't just the DEA that he feared anymore. It was the fact that every choice he made now carried the possibility of his entire world coming crashing down. For the first time, Frank wasn't the one who controlled the game. He was just a man running from a relentless storm, and he didn't know how much longer he could outrun it. The foundation that Frank had spent years building was starting to show signs of crumbling. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, as small cracks in his operations, once tight and well-oiled, began to widen. Loyalty, the one thing Frank had always prided himself on, was faltering. The people who had sworn their allegiance to him, who had stood by him through every decision, every dangerous move, were beginning to question everything. The pressure was unbearable, and it was taking a toll. Frank's empire, once untouchable, was showing signs of vulnerability that couldn't be ignored. Mistakes were being made, mistakes that never used to happen. Frank had always been a step ahead, always anticipating the moves of his rivals and the law. But now, as fear and paranoia gripped the people closest to him, errors became inevitable. A shipment goes missing, a deal falls apart, and the whispers of betrayal grow louder. Each mistake felt like a crack in the dam that was holding his world together. Frank could feel the weight of it, the slow, suffocating realization that everything he had built might come crashing down, not from the outside, but from within. As the stakes grew higher, the strain wasn't confined to the streets. It started to seep into his personal life. The constant fear, the paranoia, the relentless pressure it was wearing on everyone. Frank's relationship with his wife, and even with his children, began to deteriorate. His family, once an integral part of his operation, was now feeling the full weight of the underworld life he had dragged them into. His wife, once proud of the life Frank had given them, began to resent the constant danger, the late nights, the secrecy. She didn't recognize the man who had promised her a better life. the man who was supposed to protect them. Their home, once a sanctuary from the chaos outside, now felt more like a prison. Frank could sense the tension in the air whenever he came home, a coldness that hadn't been there before. His children, too, had started to grow distant, no longer seeing their father as a hero, but as a man who had put their lives in jeopardy. Frank felt it all. The guilt gnawed at him, but it didn't stop him from continuing down the same path. He had built this empire, and now it was falling apart at the seams. In the quiet moments, when the weight of the world seemed to settle over him, Frank began to question everything. Had it all been worth it? The money, the power, the respect, was it worth the damage it had done to the people closest to him? The man who had once seen himself as a protector of his family now felt like the cause of their suffering. His moral compass, once strong and steady, was starting to wobble. But even as his world seemed to be unraveling, Frank couldn't stop. The empire was all he had left. And as the trust in his inner circle continued to fade, Frank knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. As the walls began to close in on Frank, he realized that his position was no longer invincible. The growing pressure from law enforcement, the increased scrutiny from the DEA and FBI, and the ever-present threat of betrayal within his own organization were pushing him to a breaking point. For the first time in years, Frank found himself staring at the possibility of defeat. The city that had once bowed to his rule now seemed out of his control. In this moment of desperation, Frank did what he never thought he would. He turned to the mafia. The rivalry between Frank and the mafia had been fierce, a battle for dominance over New York's drug trade. They were once bitter enemies, each trying to carve out their own slice of power in the city. But now, with law enforcement closing in and his empire at risk, Frank knew that survival depended on an unlikely alliance. He had no choice but to swallow his pride and broker peace with those he had once considered his greatest rivals. The negotiations were tense, the room thick with distrust. Frank sat across from mafia bosses, their eyes cold and calculating. Neither side wanted to show weakness, but both knew the stakes. The terms were clear: shared profits, divided territories, and, most importantly, a mutual agreement to avoid further conflict while law enforcement hunted them down. For Frank, it was a calculated move. Combining forces with the mafia would give him the muscle and the connections he needed to hold on to his empire. But as the deal was sealed, an unease settled over him. This uneasy alliance was built on survival, not trust. As the weeks passed, Frank struggled to adjust to his new role within this strange partnership. The mafia's methods were brutal and archaic, their code of loyalty strict and unforgiving. Frank, on the other hand, had always relied on a more disciplined, business-like approach. He found himself working with men he had once despised, negotiating terms with figures who had once been the very definition of everything he wanted to avoid. The tension was palpable. Every deal, every handshake, a reminder of how far he had fallen from his once independent position. Yet, as the alliance grew stronger, so did Frank's doubts. Was this truly the best decision for his empire? Could he ever trust the very people who had once tried to destroy him? He knew the mafia had their own ambitions, and as powerful as they were, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they would eventually turn on him. The uneasy peace between them was fragile, held together by the shared need to survive. But in Frank's mind, survival alone was never enough. The constant struggle for control gnawed at him, and with every passing day, the question loomed larger. Would this alliance be the key to keeping his empire intact, or would it be the beginning of its end? Frank stood on the precipice, knowing that everything he had built was on the line. The years of blood, sweat, and countless betrayals had led him to this moment, the last big score. The heist was bigger than any shipment he had ever arranged. This was the kind of move that could solidify his place in the drug trade for good, or bring it all crashing down. Frank had been thinking about stepping away, retiring from the business. But first, he needed to set himself up for the future. A final deal that would guarantee he was untouchable, financially secure for the rest of his life. But Frank had been in this game too long not to know how quickly things could go sideways. The plan was meticulous, almost flawless. Frank had always been the architect of his own operations, preferring to stay in the shadows while everything around him fell into place. This heist would be no different. The shipment of heroin was being transported from overseas, a massive load that would fill up dozens of crates, all heading for the East Coast. If Frank could intercept it, secure the goods, and move them to his distributors, he would have more money than most could imagine. But there was a catch. The shipment was coming in under the radar, heavily protected, and there were people, rivals and law enforcement who would do anything to get their hands on it. The days leading up to the heist were filled with tension. Frank coordinated every detail, moving pieces like a chess master. He had his trusted men in place, the routes mapped out, the safe houses set up. Every move was calculated. He knew the risks, but he was no stranger to them. Frank had built his empire on risks, and it had always paid off. But this time felt different. The stakes were higher, and with every passing hour, the pressure mounted. On the night of the heist, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The convoy was moving, the men were in position, and the shipment was just within reach. Frank watched it unfold from his safe house, calm, composed. But then, just as the final step was supposed to fall into place, something went wrong. A crack in the plan. A betrayal from within his own crew. One of his men had tipped off the authorities. The chaos was instantaneous. Law enforcement closed in from every direction. Frank's heart raced. His mind worked in overdrive, trying to assess the damage. The heist was unraveling fast, and with it, everything Frank had worked for. In that split second, his reputation, his empire, and his future were in jeopardy. Frank's instincts kicked in. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now. But this was more than just business. It was personal. The sting of betrayal cut deeper than anything he had experienced before. With law enforcement breathing down his neck, Frank made a snap decision. It was time to adapt, to pull off the impossible one last time. But in this world, nothing was ever truly certain. And even Frank Lucas knew that the game was changing. The heist had been a disaster. What was supposed to be Frank's final victory turned into the beginning of his downfall. The night that started with meticulous planning quickly devolved into chaos. Frank could feel it the moment the first sirens wailed in the distance. It was a feeling he knew too well. But this time, it wasn't just a brush with danger. The authorities had been waiting for him, tracking every move, every step. They had been closing in, and now, they had him right where they wanted. Within hours, the busts began. First, one of his safe houses was raided, then another. One by one, Frank's trusted lieutenants were taken down, arrested, or worse, flipped, offering up information in exchange for leniency. Frank's empire, which had once felt impenetrable, was crumbling like a house of cards. The walls that had been built over years of blood and sacrifice were finally starting to cave in. The DEA, FBI, and NYPD had all coordinated their efforts, and they were relentless. Every step Frank took to cover his tracks seemed to lead back to him. He could no longer move through the streets with the same confidence. His network of loyal men, once solid and unwavering, was now riddled with distrust. Old allies were selling him out, and with each betrayal, Frank's grip on power weakened. The toll this took on Frank was immense. He had built his criminal empire from the ground up, and now, with the weight of the law pressing in on him, he was forced to watch it all fall apart. His mind raced as he tried to think of an escape plan, but the options were limited. Every person he trusted was either behind bars or under investigation. Even his family, once a pillar of his operation, had begun to feel the strain. Frank knew that the consequences of his life choices were finally catching up to him. In the face of it all, Frank had no choice but to go into hiding. The once proud kingpin of Harlem, the man who had ruled with calculated precision and ruthless determination, was now a fugitive. His empire had unraveled, and he could feel the walls closing in. Every movement was a risk, every conversation potentially intercepted. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. Even the shadows felt like they were watching him. His luxurious homes, once filled with the trappings of wealth, were now just empty reminders of the life he had built and was now losing. Frank Lucas, once untouchable, now found himself on the run, fighting to hold on to whatever was left of the empire he had spent so many years building. He knew that the end was near, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. The fall of his empire had begun, but Frank wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Frank Lucas had never known a life without control, but now, as a fugitive, control slipped through his fingers like sand. He moved from one safe house to another, each more transient than the last. His empire, once a well-oiled machine of money and power, had crumbled, leaving him isolated and hunted. The once loyal network of associates and family that had helped him rise to the top now became his lifeline, though even they seemed more distant, unreliable, and fearful. Every phone call he made was a risk. Every door he opened was a potential trap. He had built an empire based on trust, but now, trust was a commodity he couldn't afford. The weight of his situation was beginning to take a toll on Frank. Where once he had moved through the streets with purpose, now he was reduced to a shadow, always looking over his shoulder, always listening for footsteps that didn't belong. His once unwavering confidence had been replaced with the gnawing feeling of paranoia. Every time the phone rang, his heart raced. Every knock on the door made his skin crawl. Frank had spent years running the most profitable heroin operation on the East Coast, and now he was running for his life. His thoughts turned inward as he moved through the shadows. The house he sat in was empty, save for the silence that echoed in his ears. Frank couldn't remember the last time he had been able to sleep without fear, without wondering if it would be his last. He thought of the streets he had once controlled, the men who had worked for him, the family he had built an empire for. He thought of his mother, his wife, his children, all of them now forced into hiding or living in fear of what he had become. Frank's mind raced, his emotions a mixture of regret, guilt, and anger. He had wanted to be remembered, to leave a legacy that went beyond drugs and violence. Yet, now, his legacy seemed to be nothing but a prison of his own making. As the days passed, Frank could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of his decisions suffocating him. The life he had built had been built on sand, and now the tide was coming in, threatening to wash it all away. He wasn't sure if he could keep running. He wasn't sure if he could keep going. The face in the mirror looked different now, older, wearier, as though the weight of the world had settled onto his shoulders. He had never imagined ending up like this. He had never imagined that the empire he'd worked so hard to build would end in ruin. For the first time in years, Frank allowed himself to reflect not as a kingpin, not as a hustler, but as a man who had lost everything. His empire, his pride, his legacy, gone. What remained was a fugitive on the run, with nothing but the fear of what would come next. Frank sat in the dim light of his safe house, staring at the walls that once felt like a fortress. Now, they were closing in around him. The phone call he'd just received had shattered any remaining illusion that his empire was still standing. The news came in waves. His network was gone. Law enforcement had systematically dismantled every last thread of his operation. His men, once loyal, were either in custody or had turned on him, offering up his name in exchange for leniency. The DEA and FBI had them all, piece by piece, and now the inevitable had arrived. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing to process the reality of it all. He had spent years building this empire, climbing from the depths of poverty to a level of power that few could imagine. But now, it was over. The kingdom he had ruled from the shadows, with precision and ruthlessness, had crumbled in the face of relentless law enforcement pressure and betrayal from those closest to him. Frank had always prided himself on staying one step ahead, but now that advantage had evaporated. The phone line crackled again, the voice on the other end almost unrecognizable. It was one of his remaining allies, or at least, he thought they were. Now, they were simply another piece of the puzzle falling apart. The voice hesitated, then delivered the final blow. "Frank, it's over. They're on their way. They're coming for you. I can't help you anymore." It was the final betrayal, the one that hurt the most. Frank had always known this day could come, but he never believed it would feel like this, like the floor beneath him was falling away. He dropped the phone, feeling the weight of his choices crash down on him. His life, the life he'd built on the streets, was no longer his to control. He had always known the risks, but he had never anticipated being abandoned by the very people he trusted. His mind flashed to the faces of his family, his wife, and children, all forced into hiding, all having to live with the consequences of his actions. He thought of the people in Harlem, the ones who looked up to him, the ones who called him their hero. And now, they were left with nothing but memories of a man who once ruled it all. Frank's body was shaking, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of defeat. He had one choice left: to fight, to run, or to surrender. But he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. As the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, he felt a sinking in his chest. The world had caught up to him, and for the first time in years, he was powerless to stop it. The door swung open, and a former ally stepped into the room. Frank looked up, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was the final betrayal. The man had once been a trusted partner, someone who knew the ins and outs of the operation, someone Frank had relied on. Now, he was the one who had come to close the chapter on Frank's reign. "Frank," the man said, voice cold and distant, "it's over." The news hit Frank like a punch to the gut. His hands shook as the words sank in his most trusted confidant, the one he had known longer than anyone in his circle, had been feeding information to the FBI. The very man who had helped him build his empire, who had stood by him through countless deals and betrayals, was now the reason his world was crumbling. The betrayal cut deeper than any enemy's bullet, severing the last thread of loyalty that had held his operation together. Frank had built his empire on trust, on the unspoken bond between him and the people who worked for him. He had always believed that loyalty was the foundation of everything, that without it, nothing could stand. Now, that belief felt hollow. The very core of his organization was rotting from within, and he could feel it. Every decision, every move he made, had been tainted by the realization that his closest ally was now a traitor. It wasn't just the loss of his empire, it was the loss of his faith in the people he had surrounded himself with. And that, more than anything, stung. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was strategic. Frank knew the FBI would never have gotten this far without someone inside feeding them details, guiding them, setting the stage for his eventual fall. He could almost hear the clicks of the wiretaps, the sound of the surveillance cameras capturing every move, every conversation. But it was the knowledge that the man he had trusted most had been the one to hand him over to the wolves that made the situation unbearable. The confrontation came quickly. Frank had always believed in dealing with problems head-on, and this was no different. He found the man in a rundown apartment on the edge of the city, alone. There was no pretense now, no pleasantries. Frank didn't bother with words at first. The look in his eyes said everything. He moved toward the man, slowly, deliberately. The air in the room felt thick, tense, as if the whole world was holding its breath. What the hell happened? Frank's voice was quiet, but it held a weight that made the man tremble. I had no choice, the betrayer muttered, his voice cracking. They were gonna destroy everything, Frank. They promised me they'd leave me and my family alone. I didn't know what else to do. Frank's eyes narrowed, the betrayal cutting deeper. He took a step closer, his anger building with every word the man spoke. You could have come to me. You could have trusted me. But trust was gone now. It was no longer something they could share. The decision had already been made, and the consequences would be severe. In the end, Frank didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The violence was swift, as it always was when there was nothing left to say. The man who had once been his brother now lay on the floor, his blood staining the carpet. But even as Frank stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes fixed on the lifeless body at his feet, he knew that this wasn't just the end for the traitor. It was the beginning of the end for Frank himself. The support network he had so carefully constructed was crumbling, and no amount of force or power would stop what was coming next. He was alone now, and the inevitable capture was looming closer than ever. The moment came with a suddenness Frank didn't expect, though deep down, he knew it was inevitable. The raid hit like a storm, swift and ruthless. 1 minute, he was sitting in the dim light of a safe house, watching the world outside like it had been his domain for years. The next, the world he had carefully built started to collapse around him. The DEA, FBI, everyone he had managed to avoid for so long was at his door. It wasn't the flash of sirens or the sound of boots on the pavement that caught him off guard. Frank had lived through too many close calls to be surprised by a raid. It was the finality of it, the end of his reign. His empire, once untouchable, now crumbling beneath the weight of its own secrets. He had always been one step ahead, always calculating the risks, always able to slip through the cracks. But now, those cracks had closed in. In that moment, Frank didn't panic. He was too proud for that. He had fought tooth and nail for everything he'd built, and he wasn't about to go down without a fight. But the escape plans he had been running through his mind for years no longer seemed as flawless as they once had. He moved quickly, but not quickly enough. His legs felt heavy, as if the weight of his own decisions was finally catching up with him. He reached for his gun, but before he could make a move, the door slammed open. There were no words, just the sound of boots crashing into the floor and the flash of lights outside. Frank's heart pounded, but he stood still, trying to gauge his next move. One last escape, one last attempt to outrun the inevitable. But this time, there was no place to run. He darted for the back door, but before he could even reach the alley, the cold barrel of a gun pressed against his back. "You're done, Lucas," a voice said. There was no triumph in it, no victory, just a quiet, certain finality. Frank knew it was over. The game had ended. The media frenzy began almost immediately. News outlets descended on the scene, cameras flashing, reporters screaming his name. The kingpin who had ruled the heroin trade in Harlem for over a decade was no longer the shadowy figure in the streets. He was just a man in handcuffs, standing under the glare of the spotlight he had spent his life avoiding. As he was led into the back of a police car, Frank glanced around. His face was a mixture of defiance and resignation. His empire was finished, but the name, the legend, would linger long after the arrest. Inside the holding cell, Frank sat in silence. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a quiet, heavy feeling in the pit of his stomach. The reality of his downfall settled in. His power, his empire, everything he had fought for, was gone. And now, as he faced the waiting law enforcement officers, the truth was clear. The fall from the top was final. The trial was everything Frank had feared, but also something he had long been prepared for. The once untouchable kingpin, who had dominated the heroin trade in Harlem, now sat in a courtroom where his every move was scrutinized. His reputation had carried him far, but in the sterile, impersonal world of law, it meant little. The prosecutor's case against him was airtight, backed by testimony from informants and evidence that painted a picture of the empire he had built and the destruction it left in its wake. Frank's defense team, some of the best lawyers money could buy, worked tirelessly to keep the weight of his crimes from crashing down. They painted him as a victim of circumstance, a man who had been forced into the life of crime by his upbringing. They worked to appeal to the jury's sympathy, trying to create doubt, but even they knew it was a long shot. Frank watched them work, but in the back of his mind, he knew that no defense, no amount of money, could change the fact that he was no longer the man he used to be. His myth, the one he had carefully cultivated over the years, was unraveling, piece by piece. Every day in court, Frank sat with his hands folded, staring straight ahead, trying to maintain an air of defiance. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Even as the evidence piled up against him, he refused to break. He would never admit guilt. Not in front of these strangers, not in front of a system that had finally caught up to him. He wasn't going to let them see the cracks in the man who had once walked through the streets of Harlem like a king. But as the trial dragged on, Frank's resolve began to waver. The witnesses who had once been loyal to him now stood against him in the courtroom, recounting the details of his operations with chilling precision. The lawyers who had worked alongside him, the lieutenants who had once sworn loyalty, now sat on the opposite side, testifying about the bloodshed, the bribes, and the ruthless methods that had made Frank Lucas the most feared drug dealer in New York. Each testimony cut deeper than the last. The empire he had built, the one he had poured everything into, was now being reduced to a series of cold facts and damning stories. And as the trial neared its conclusion, Frank could no longer ignore the inevitable. His life as a kingpin, his reign over the heroin trade, was over. In the final moments, Frank sat still in his chair, staring at the jury, as if willing them to see him as the man he once was. But he knew. The empire was gone, and with it, so was the myth. What remained was a man, nothing more, facing the consequences of his choices. The courtroom was silent as one of Frank's former lieutenants took the stand, and Frank's grip tightened around the arms of his chair. The man who had once sworn loyalty to him, worked for him, and had been a trusted member of his operation, now spoke with cold indifference. Frank had seen men like him come and go, those who were willing to do whatever it took to survive in the drug trade. He had always believed that loyalty was the one thing that kept his empire intact. But now, as this man told the jury about the heroin shipments, the murders, and the violence that had defined Frank's reign, Frank felt something inside him snap. He had never anticipated this kind of betrayal. This wasn't just the end of his empire, it was the end of everything he had built, everything he had trusted. The words coming from the witness box cut deep. Frank tried to keep his composure, but the anger inside him was impossible to ignore. How had it all come to this? The faces of his family, his closest allies, his brothers flashed before his eyes. The realization of how many lives he had ruined began to settle in. For the first time, Frank was truly forced to confront the destruction he had caused. There was no running from it now. The testimony wasn't just about the drug deals, the money, or the power. It was about the people he had turned into ghosts, those who had trusted him, believed in him, and had paid the price for his ambition. It was about the lives of the mothers who had lost their sons to the drugs he sold, the families torn apart by the violence he had created, and the law enforcement officers whose careers had been built on trying to catch him. Then came the devastating moment, the day his family was called to the stand. His wife, the one person who had stuck by him through everything, sat there, her face strained with emotion, her eyes filled with sadness. The children he had raised, the ones who had once looked up to him as their protector, now looked at him with a mix of confusion and pain. They spoke about how his actions had torn their lives apart, how the constant fear had stripped away any sense of security they had ever known. His son's voice, once filled with pride when he spoke of his father, now trembled with raw grief as he recounted the toll of Frank's criminal life. In that moment, Frank felt the weight of everything he had lost. The empire, the money, the power, it all seemed so distant now. The dreams he had once nurtured, the idea that he was providing for his family, now felt like a cruel illusion. His legacy was no longer something to be proud of. It was a series of mistakes, broken relationships, and shattered lives. As the testimonies continued, Frank's mind began to unravel. He had always believed he could outsmart the system, that he was untouchable. But as the walls closed in and his past was laid bare before him, he understood the true cost of his choices. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could ever forgive himself. The room was tense as the jury filed back into the courtroom. Frank Lucas sat motionless, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of his chair. His mind, once sharp and calculated, felt clouded now, distant. The sound of the jury foreman's voice broke the silence, and Frank's stomach tightened. He had heard the whispers, seen the signs, but nothing could have fully prepared him for the final blow. The words were clear: guilty on all charges. The weight of it hit him like a freight train. For years, he had been the one holding the power, the one issuing orders, the one who had always managed to stay ahead. He had never once thought that this day would come. The man who had risen from the streets of North Carolina, the one who had controlled a heroin empire that stretched across the East Coast, was now nothing more than a convicted criminal. The reality of it stung, deeper than any betrayal, sharper than any bullet wound. It wasn't just the loss of his freedom, it was the collapse of everything he had built. Frank's face remained expressionless as the room around him seemed to blur. The murmurs of the courtroom faded into a dull hum. In those few moments, he let himself feel the enormity of the consequences. His mind raced back to the people he had hurt, the mothers who had lost children, the families who had suffered because of the drug epidemic he had fueled. The guilt washed over him like a tidal wave, crashing down with an intensity he had never experienced before. There had been a time when he would have fought, shouted, and tried to manipulate the situation to his advantage. But now, in this moment, there was no more fight left in him. As the verdict sank in, Frank found himself lost in thought, reflecting on the empire he had built, the lives it had ruined, and the legacy he would leave behind. The blue magic, the power, the riches, it had all seemed worth it at the time. But standing here now, facing the cold reality of a lifetime in prison, it felt hollow. The empire had crumbled, and so had he. There was nothing left but the wreckage of his choices, the shattered relationships, and the families whose lives had been destroyed in the wake of his ambition. The judge's voice snapped him out of his thoughts as he called for the sentencing hearing. Frank's pulse quickened as the possibility of a life sentence loomed over him. He had heard whispers of a plea deal, a potential way out, but the government's grip was tightening. As he sat there, waiting for the next chapter of his life to unfold, Frank couldn't help but wonder if he could ever make peace with the destruction he had caused. His legacy was sealed now, for better or worse, and no amount of money or power could change that. The courtroom had barely emptied before the real fallout began. Frank Lucas's conviction reverberated across the streets of Harlem and beyond, causing a ripple effect that could not be undone. His empire, once vast and untouchable, came crashing down in a flurry of arrests, betrayals, and hasty power grabs. His trusted lieutenants, those who had stood by him through thick and thin, found themselves in similar positions, facing charges, turning on each other, and scrambling to save their own skins. The intricate network he had built with such precision began to unravel at the seams, and new players emerged, eager to fill the vacuum left by his downfall. For Harlem, Frank's conviction marked the end of an era. The streets that had once pulsed with the steady hum of blue magic now felt quieter, the shadows deeper. The drug trade, however, didn't disappear. It evolved, adapting to the absence of its former kingpin. Other players, less charismatic but equally ruthless, stepped in, continuing the cycle of addiction that Frank had both fueled and profited from. The lives torn apart by heroin in the neighborhoods Frank had once ruled didn't stop. They only shifted hands, moving from one dealer to the next, from one empire to another, as if the addiction itself was the true king of Harlem. Frank's family bore the brunt of the wreckage. His wife, devastated by the exposure of his criminal life, withdrew into the shadows, trying to shield their children from the relentless public attention. The kids, once distant from the gritty details of their father's world, now had no choice but to face the ugly truth. Frank's daughter, once so proud of the life he had built for them, found herself grappling with the shame that came with being the daughter of one of the most notorious drug lords in American history. She clung to the hope that there was more to her father than the legacy of violence and destruction, but that hope was gradually worn away by the relentless media coverage and the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. The public reaction was a complicated mix of relief and resentment. For many, Frank's conviction was justice finally served. He had become a symbol of the rampant drug trade, the greed and violence that had poisoned the streets for too long. But there were others who mourned the loss of the legend he had become, a man who had risen from nothing to become a force to be reckoned with. To them, Frank Lucas was more than a criminal. He was a symbol of defiance against a system that had ignored the struggles of people like him. The end of his reign was not just a legal victory, it was the closing of a chapter in Harlem's storied history. Despite the conviction, the addiction epidemic that Frank had helped fuel did not end. The faces changed, the names of the kingpins shifted, but the cycle remained the same. The damage Frank had done could not be undone by his arrest, nor could the lives lost be revived by the fall of his empire. The streets of Harlem, though quieter, still whispered his name, a reminder of a time when one man had held the power to change everything, only to see it all slip away in the end. Life behind bars was nothing like the throne Frank Lucas had once occupied in Harlem. The transition from kingpin to prisoner was a brutal awakening, one that tore at the fabric of his identity. He had been a man who controlled the lives of many, who could make entire neighborhoods tremble with just a glance. But in prison, he was just another number, another face in the sea of inmates. His status, his empire, and all the fear he had once commanded seemed to vanish overnight. Frank had to learn quickly how to navigate the harsh realities of life in prison. The guards weren't his allies, and the other inmates were either indifferent or hostile. His reputation, once legendary, held little weight in this new world. There were those who had worked for him during his reign in Harlem, men who once answered to him, now just another part of the prison's underbelly. Some respected him, others hated him, seeing him as the man who had ruined lives with his drug empire. Frank found himself caught between these two forces, trying to keep his head down while maintaining enough power to protect himself from the dangers that came with being a notorious figure in a prison full of violent men. It didn't take long for Frank to realize that in this new world, his street smarts and cunning were his best tools. He had spent years building trust, forging relationships in the shadows of Harlem's streets, and now he relied on those same skills to survive. He learned quickly who to trust, who to stay away from, and who held the real power behind the prison walls. He made alliances with men who owed him favors, but he also learned to recognize the prisoners who had no qualms about turning on him if it suited their needs. Despite his efforts to stay in control, Frank soon faced the harsh truth. He was no longer the one calling the shots. The system had its hold on him now. He had gone from the man who made others bend to his will to someone whose fate was determined by others. The prison system was a machine, and Frank was just another cog in its gears. There were moments, late at night in his small cell, when he couldn't escape the weight of that reality. His empire, his legacy, the life he had built, none of it mattered here. He had nothing left but the walls around him, the constant noise of the prison, and the undeniable truth that his life was no longer his own. In those moments, Frank came face to face with a bitter truth. His reign was over, and there was no way to turn back the clock. He had lost the one thing he had always relied on: control. The man who had once been untouchable, who had ruled Harlem with a sense of unshakable certainty, was now vulnerable, at the mercy of the system he had so often defied. And for the first time in his life, Frank Lucas was powerless. The offer came like a cold gust of wind, slipping through the cracks of the prison walls, wrapping itself around Frank's resolve and forcing him to face the reality of his situation: a plea deal. It was the kind of offer he had been warned about for years, the kind that destroyed reputations, shattered loyalties, and left men like him with nothing but regrets. The government was offering Frank a chance to reduce his sentence, to escape the life sentence that loomed over him like a shadow, in exchange for his cooperation. They wanted names, information, every detail about his network, about the men who had worked for him, and the criminals he had once called his allies. Frank sat in his cell, the paperwork laid out in front of him, the ink fresh on the page. He knew what this meant. If he signed, if he cooperated, he would betray every man who had ever trusted him, every friend he had ever made. He would hand over the names of his partners, the very men who had helped build his empire, people who had risked everything for the wealth and power that Frank had promised. To take this deal would mean destroying the legacy he had spent his life building. He would be no better than the snitches he had once despised. But the pressure was relentless. Law enforcement was closing in, tightening their grip, and the walls of the prison seemed to grow higher and higher with each passing day. His family was imploring him to take the deal, to reduce his sentence, to save what was left of their lives. They knew Frank's life had been one of violence, betrayal, and loss, but they wanted him out. They wanted a chance at a normal life, away from the ruins of his empire. And then there was Frank himself, the man who had controlled everything, who had commanded loyalty, fear, and respect, now facing the humbling truth that he could no longer control his own fate. He wanted redemption, but he didn't know if this was the way. Was this the only way out? To hand over the very people who had trusted him? His heart was torn between the desire for freedom and the deep, unwavering loyalty he felt to those who had helped him. In the end, Frank chose the deal. He signed the papers, agreeing to testify about the drug dealers, the corrupt officials, and the network he had built. It was a choice that shattered something deep inside him, a piece of his soul that would never be whole again. He stood up in that courtroom, his words heavy with the weight of betrayal, knowing that the fallout would be brutal. His former allies would see him as a traitor, his reputation irreparably tarnished. But at least, for the first time in years, Frank felt as though he had some semblance of control again, even if it came at the cost of his humanity. When Frank Lucas finally walked out of the prison gates, the world that awaited him felt like a distant echo, a place that had moved on without him. His cooperation with the authorities had earned him a reduced sentence, and though he was no longer a prisoner, he felt trapped by the choices he had made, by the legacy he had built, and by the man he had become. The streets he once ruled felt foreign now, as if time had swept them away, leaving behind only the shadows of what had once been. The adjustment wasn't easy. Frank had spent decades at the top of the drug trade, a kingpin feared by many and admired by a few. He had commanded loyalty, respect, and a fortune that most men would have killed for. But now, all of that was gone, reduced to memories, rumors, and a life sentence in the past. He had to adapt, but the skills that had served him in the world of crime, manipulation, power, control, were no longer relevant. The game had changed, and Frank was a relic of a bygone era. His family's reaction to his release was complicated. Some members embraced him, welcoming him back with open arms, hoping for a fresh start. But others remained distant, bitter over the destruction his choices had caused. They had seen him as the man who had given them everything, but they also saw the wreckage of the life he had led, the lives ruined by his ambition. They had to balance love for the man they once knew with the reality of the man he had become. Frank felt the weight of that distance, the emotional gaps that couldn't be bridged with apologies or promises. And so, Frank found himself standing at the edge of a world he no longer recognized, a world that had changed while he was locked away. The world of luxury, of power, of fast cars and endless money. Those things no longer mattered. The new world was about technology, new industries, and people who had never heard of the Blue Magic Empire. He was out of place in a society that had evolved without him. His time had passed, and Frank was left to navigate a life that had no place for him. As he walked through the streets of Harlem, now gentrified and unfamiliar, the sense of alienation gnawed at him. The faces he had once seen as allies, as loyal followers, now seemed like strangers. His old connections were either gone or unwilling to acknowledge him. He no longer had the respect he once commanded. His name, once feared, was now a distant memory. Frank had always been a man who had shaped the world around him, but now, the world felt like it was shaping him. He realized that no matter how hard he tried, he could never outrun his past. It lingered in the spaces between the steps he took, in the silent judgment of the people he passed. And while Frank Lucas may have left prison behind, prison never truly left him. When Frank Lucas returned to Harlem, the place he had once ruled with an iron fist, the changes hit him like a sudden cold wind. The streets, once filled with the buzz of his empire and the thrum of illicit deals, had transformed into something unrecognizable. Where there used to be familiar storefronts and corner dealers, there were now chic cafes and trendy boutiques. The unmistakable scent of luxury condos lingered in the air, and the sound of construction filled the spaces where street vendors and hustlers used to stand. Gentrification had swept through Harlem like a wave, washing away the soul of the neighborhood he once knew so well. Frank moved through these streets with a mixture of disbelief and nostalgia. He saw the same buildings, but they were now polished and new, their walls bearing no scars from the decades of struggle and survival. The old street culture that had once thrived here, the pulse of the community he had dominated, was gone. It wasn't just the buildings that had changed, it was the people too. The ones he had once known as loyal allies or competitors were either gone, buried in the past, or long gone to other paths, leaving behind only shadows of their former selves. In the shadows, some old faces still lingered, their lives twisted by the same addiction to power and profit that had drawn Frank to the streets all those years ago. A few of his old associates, those who had survived the fall of his empire, still worked the corners, still played the same game with new players, perhaps not as powerful, but still in it. Frank exchanged a few words with some of them, but the conversations were awkward, almost strained. The bond they once shared seemed fragile, shattered by time and his own fall from grace. In many ways, Frank no longer belonged in this world, a king who had fallen, leaving only the vestiges of his rule. His return to Harlem wasn't a triumphant one. It was more like a pilgrimage to a place that had once been his kingdom, only now it was a kingdom he no longer ruled. There was a quiet reverence when people spoke of his name, and in some corners, fear still lingered in their voices. But Frank could feel the distance. His power was no longer something that could be measured in cash or territory. His reputation was revered, yes, but it was more like a legend now, a story told in whispers rather than a living, breathing force that commanded respect. Frank had once been untouchable. Now, he was just another figure in a history that seemed to have moved on without him. He walked these streets, trying to reconnect, to rebuild something of the life he once had. But it wasn't just the neighborhood that had changed. It was him, too. He realized that no matter how much he tried, no matter how hard he worked to recapture the power he once had, it was gone. The empire he built had crumbled, and the streets of Harlem had moved forward without him. As Frank sat alone in his small apartment, the city hummed outside, but his mind was elsewhere. Lost in the labyrinth of his past, the memories came like waves crashing against a shore, some of them violent, others quieter, but all equally hard to escape. He thought about the streets of Harlem, how they once bent to his will. He remembered the days when he had walked with a certain swagger, a sense of invincibility that came from building an empire with his own two hands. At that time, he had never imagined that he would fall from grace, that the power he held so tightly would slip from his fingers like sand. Flashbacks to key moments in his life filled his mind. The first time he had tasted success, the deals, the money, the rush of knowing that he had outsmarted everyone who had ever tried to take him down. He thought of his early days, of growing up in the harsh, unforgiving world of North Carolina, where survival was the only thing that mattered. It had shaped him, forged him into the man who would rise from nothing to become the most feared kingpin in New York. But as the memories unfolded, so did the truth. The decisions that had led him to the world of drugs, the sacrifices made along the way, and the people he had hurt. The cost of ambition was something Frank had never fully understood until it was too late. He had wanted more, always more, and it had cost him everything. Power had consumed him, twisted his mind, and corrupted his soul. But now, in the stillness of his life, after it all came crashing down, Frank could see the toll it had taken. He had betrayed the very people who had trusted him most, torn apart his family with his choices, and left behind a trail of destruction. His empire, once a symbol of power and control, was nothing more than a distant memory, a cautionary tale that no one cared to hear anymore. In those quiet moments of reflection, Frank tried to reconcile his past with his present. Could he ever find peace within himself? Could he ever make sense of the choices he had made and the paths he had taken? He had built something out of nothing, yes, but at what cost? The guilt weighed heavy on him, and no matter how hard he tried to shake it off, it clung to him like a shadow. The faces of his loved ones, his wife, his children, the people he had once called family haunted him. He had promised them the world, but all they had ever gotten from him was pain. In the quiet of his apartment, Frank acknowledged something he had never fully confronted before: the damage he had done, the lives he had ruined. He could no longer hide behind the myth of his success. The man who had once ruled Harlem now sat alone, reflecting on the price of his ambition. And in that moment, he finally understood that no amount of money, power, or respect could ever undo the damage he had caused. Frank's days felt long, each one marked by a struggle that went beyond the physical. The weight of his past hung over him like a storm cloud, a reminder of who he had been and what he had done. Redemption, as he had come to learn, wasn't just about feeling sorry for himself. It was about making amends for the damage he had caused, the lives he had shattered. And yet, as much as he tried to turn the page, the past would not let him go. In his quieter moments, Frank would look at the faces of his children and his wife, and the pain would twist inside him. He had failed them. His ambition, his insatiable hunger for power, had torn their lives apart. No apology, no amount of time, could undo the scars he had left behind. But still, he tried. He poured himself into supporting them in ways that mattered now, sending his children to college, making sure they lived in safe neighborhoods, doing his best to be there for them when they needed him most. It wasn't much, but it was all he had to give. And yet, even in his attempts to rebuild, Frank could feel the distance, the space between them. It wasn't just the years, it was the lies, the broken promises. Redemption was a long road, and forgiveness, he realized, was not a gift you could demand, it had to be earned. Frank also began to reach out to the people in Harlem, the community he had once tried to control. He tried to make a difference, not with money or power, but by supporting the businesses he had once exploited, helping local schools, and contributing to programs that could give kids a future that didn't involve the same path he had walked. He had seen the damage his empire had done to the streets, and now, in his own small way, he wanted to repair it. Yet every step forward was met with the constant reminder of who he had been. People didn't forget. They couldn't. How could they? He had built an empire on lies and violence, and now that same legacy followed him wherever he went. The hardest part was the temptation. The streets he had walked for so long still called to him. The familiar faces, the old associates who had once revered him, still lingered in the shadows of his mind. Sometimes, it felt easier to return to the life he knew. The money, the power, it was all so tempting, but Frank knew, deep down, that the price of going back was higher than anything he was willing to pay. Every time the thought crossed his mind, he felt the pull of his old self, but he resisted, knowing that every choice he made from here on out had to be different. And so, Frank walked the line between the man he had been and the man he hoped to become. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was a constant struggle, and one that Frank was willing to fight for, no matter the cost. The weight of Frank's past loomed over his attempts to reconnect with his family, and despite his best efforts, the walls between them grew higher, not lower. His wife, Lucille, bore scars he could never truly heal. Not after the years of neglect and pain his criminal life had inflicted on her. Her forgiveness, though given in quiet moments, never felt complete. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the past, to the broken promises, to the days when Frank was a stranger to his own home. The love they once shared felt like something distant, something he had lost in his pursuit of power and wealth. She often said nothing at all, her silence speaking louder than any words she could offer. Frank could feel her eyes on him, but there was a coldness there now, a distance he couldn't cross, no matter how hard he tried. His children, too, were caught in the web of his past, and though they all wanted to move on, their hearts were divided. His eldest son, Omar, had inherited Frank's temper and his defiance, but there was no place for that when the world saw them as the family of a notorious drug lord. Frank had been absent for too long, too consumed by his own ambition, and now, Omar couldn't look at him without resentment. Every conversation seemed to end in frustration, and Frank couldn't find a way to bridge the gap. He had been locked away when his son needed him the most, and no amount of money or gifts could make up for those lost years. There were times when Frank would catch his son's eye, and he could see the anger in those eyes, a mirror of his own when he was young, when the world seemed unfair and the weight of his family's name was too heavy to bear. Omar's voice often cracked with emotion as he spoke of his childhood, how he had been left behind, how he had grown up without his father there to guide him. Frank didn't have the words to make it right. Nothing could fill the emptiness. Nothing could erase the anger that had built up over the years. His younger children, too, were affected, though they carried the shame differently. They wore the name Lucas with pride in public, but behind closed doors, they felt the sting of being associated with a criminal empire. The legacy of power and fear Frank had built for them was a weight they could never escape. It wasn't just the public's perception that hurt, it was the way they saw themselves now, shaped by the choices he had made. They didn't want his money or his name anymore. They just wanted to be free of the shadow he had cast over their lives. And Frank, in the quiet moments, realized something he had never fully considered before. Redemption through family might be harder than any of the battles he had fought on the streets. The love he longed for, the trust he sought to rebuild, would take more than money or promises. It would take time, and maybe even more than he had left. Frank left Harlem with a quiet sense of finality, as if the city that had once been his kingdom had become a cage he could no longer escape. He settled in a small, quiet town far from the chaos of his past, hoping that distance would bring a sense of peace he had never known. The streets here were different, slower. The people were kind but wary, and Frank often felt like an outsider, like he didn't belong in this world. He had traded the fast-paced, dangerous life he had known for a new existence, one where the hustle was replaced by hard work and honesty. But as the days wore on, he began to wonder if he had truly escaped the shadow of his past, or if it would always follow him, no matter how far he ran. He started working in construction, something completely removed from the world he had built on violence and fear. It was grueling, physical work, but there was something grounding about it. It was honest, it was straightforward, and it was a far cry from the web of deceit he had spun for years. Frank told himself that this was his chance to redeem himself, to build something real, something that didn't rely on corruption or crime. But even in this new life, old habits and instincts often resurfaced. He found it hard to trust people, to take their words at face value. His mind, conditioned for years to operate in a world of manipulation and power, struggled to adapt to the simplicity of honest dealings. The difficulties were more than just the work itself. There was a constant internal battle, a turmoil that refused to quiet. Every time Frank put his hands to work, whether it was lifting beams or pushing a wheelbarrow, a part of him wondered if he could ever escape the man he used to be. He thought of his empire, the money, the respect, the fear. And then he thought of the lives he had ruined, the people he had hurt, the families he had torn apart. Could he truly leave all that behind? Was it even possible to build a new life when the foundation of his past was so deeply ingrained? Self-doubt began to creep in. Was it too late for redemption? Could a man like him, who had spent his life making choices that led to destruction, ever truly change? Every failure, every small setback in his new life, felt like proof that he wasn't capable of making the transformation he so desperately wanted. The weight of his past pressed down on him, and he wondered if he was fooling himself, if there was any point in trying to change when the ghosts of his past would always haunt him. It was during one of these moments of doubt that Frank looked in the mirror and asked himself a question he had never truly confronted. Am I worth anything outside of what I built on the streets? For the first time, he wasn't sure of the answer. The question lingered, unresolved, as he stared back at the man he had become, wondering if the life he had fought so hard to leave behind would ever truly let him go. Despite Frank's best efforts to distance himself from the life he had once known, reminders of his past seemed to follow him wherever he went. Every day felt like a battle, not only against the ghosts of his former self, but also against the temptation to slip back into the world that had given him so much. It started with the occasional phone call former associates who had once served under him, now out of prison and looking for favors. They came to him not out of respect, but because they knew he still had ties to the criminal network that had once been his empire. They asked for money, for introductions, for protection, simple favors that held the weight of temptation in every word. Frank would listen, sometimes more out of politeness than anything else, but each request made his struggle even harder. The calls soon turned into visits. Old friends, some he trusted, some he never should have came knocking on his door, seeking to re-establish ties. Frank felt their eyes on him, waiting for a sign, a crack in his resolve. The temptation was there, and it was strong. These men were reminders of the wealth and power he had once wielded, of the respect that had been handed to him like a crown. What was it all worth now? He had given it up for a quiet life, for redemption. But how long could he keep pretending he didn't miss it? As the weeks passed, Frank's internal battle grew more intense. There were moments, late at night when the weight of his decisions seemed unbearable, that he questioned his choices. Could he really walk away from everything he had built? Money, influence, control. He had given up so much, but would it be enough to erase the hunger for more? He could feel it deep inside, a restlessness that refused to go away. The quiet life, the humble work in construction, felt like a faint shadow of the power he had once held. It was safe, but it was small, insignificant compared to the empire he had ruled. And sometimes, just sometimes, he wondered if he could still take it back. Then came the encounters with his old enemies. Once, they had feared him. Now, they looked at him with a mix of pity and disdain. They saw him as a shadow of the man he once was, a fallen king trying to cling to a life that no longer belonged to him. Their words stung, even though Frank tried to brush them off. They had no respect for the man who had tried to change, the man who had given up the power they once coveted. He felt their contempt, and it gnawed at him. Had I really changed, or was I just pretending? It was in those moments, surrounded by the coldness of his old enemies and the weight of his past, that Frank came to a brutal realization. No matter how far he ran, no matter how many times he tried to reinvent himself, his past would always find a way to haunt him. It was like a shadow that never left, lingering behind him, reminding him of who he had been and what he could never escape. Frank sat alone in the small, dimly lit apartment that had become his sanctuary. The quiet hum of the city outside felt distant, almost surreal compared to the chaos that had once filled his life. He had tried to keep his head down, to live a life far removed from the world he had created. But now, just when he thought he had finally broken free, an old associate showed up at his door with a proposition that tested every fiber of his being. The offer was simple: return to the heroin trade, make a fortune, and regain the power he had lost. The payout was enough to make him question everything he had worked for. The money was tempting. The allure of wealth, of control, was something he hadn't felt in years. But with that temptation came a weighty reminder of the cost. Frank wasn't just being asked to break the law again. He was being asked to betray everything he had tried to rebuild: the trust of his family, the peace he had worked so hard to establish, and the chance at redemption he could never quite let go of. As he sat there, his mind raced through the possibilities. He had seen what the drug trade did to people. He had watched friends, family, and entire communities be destroyed by the same empire he had built. But this was different. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about survival. Frank was no stranger to temptation, but now the stakes were higher. There was no longer the illusion of invincibility. He wasn't the untouchable kingpin he once was. He had seen what happened when men like him got greedy, when they ignored the consequences and chased one last score. He had learned that no empire, no matter how powerful, lasts forever. And yet, the thought of walking away from all that money, the chance to secure a future that was beyond his wildest dreams, gnawed at him. But as the hours passed and he thought it over, Frank began to see the full picture. He imagined the look in his children's eyes if he went back to that life. The disillusionment, the disappointment. He saw the pain in his wife's face, the exhaustion of living with a man who was always on the run. He thought about the years lost to the greed, to the violence, to the lies. He had a chance now to build something real, to leave behind the chains of his past. The temptation to return to the life he had once known was strong, but the consequences were too clear. Frank knew that once he stepped back into that world, there would be no coming out again. The stakes were too high. He had already lost everything once. The last thing he could afford to lose now was himself. With a deep breath, Frank made his decision. He would walk away from the deal, knowing the cost of returning to the past was too great. The money, the power, it wasn't worth it anymore. He had learned that some things were worth more than gold. It wasn't about the fortune. It was about peace. And that, Frank knew, was priceless. Frank sat alone in the quiet of his living room, the faint hum of the city outside barely reaching his ears. His thoughts drifted back to the days when he had ruled Harlem, when his name was synonymous with power, fear, and respect. He had started from nothing, a poor country boy with a hunger for success and the belief that he could escape the life he was born into. And he had done it, built an empire, amassed wealth, controlled territories, and lived a life others could only dream of. But now, looking back, it all seemed like a distant memory, one tainted with regret. The highs had been intoxicating, the rush of power coursing through his veins, the feeling that he could control everything and everyone. The money had flowed in, faster than he ever imagined. He had women, cars, mansions, the trappings of success that everyone admired, but few truly understood. There was no thrill like seeing his empire expand, knowing that every corner of Harlem, every inch of the East Coast, had his touch. He had thought he was untouchable, the king of his world, a man who had mastered the game, but the price of that power had been high. As the years passed, Frank had learned that nothing in this world was permanent. The very empire he had built was the one that ultimately destroyed him. The streets he had once controlled became his prison. The friends who had once been loyal became his enemies, and the family he had fought so hard to protect slipped away, unable to bear the weight of his actions. His rise to the top had been swift, but his fall had been inevitable. The world he had created was built on a foundation of lies, betrayal, and blood. Now, as he sat there, the reality of his life seemed clear. He had been a king, yes, but the crown had always been heavy. It had brought him respect, yes, but it had also brought enemies, betrayal, and, in the end, loneliness. He had chased power, but it had never brought him the peace he sought. It had never filled the emptiness inside. Frank watched a news segment about his former empire. The images flashed on the screen, the crackdowns, the busts, the fall of the kingpin who had once controlled it all. It struck him how much of his life had been spent building something that would never last. He had tried to leave it behind, but it was still there, lingering in the public's memory, etched into the city's history. He knew now that his legacy would never be defined by the man he could have been. It would always be defined by the kingpin he became, the empire he built, and the destruction he left in his wake. The man who had been too hungry for power to ever truly understand the cost of getting it. In the silence of the room, Frank sat still, staring at the screen, as the memories of his past played in his mind. The world he had created was gone, and all that remained was the man he had become. Frank had spent years in the shadows, but now, he was trying to carve out a life under the harsh light of redemption. The days of sitting on top of an empire had long passed, and the weight of his past seemed to follow him wherever he went. He worked odd jobs, construction, warehouse work, anything to keep himself busy, to fill the time that used to be taken up by deals, power moves, and the adrenaline rush of ruling Harlem. Every time he picked up a tool or clocked in for a shift, he could feel the stark contrast between his former life and the one he was trying to build. But the work wasn't enough to silence the demons. Frank tried to connect with his community, going into schools, talking to kids about the dangers of drugs, the choices he made that led him down a path he couldn't escape. His story became a warning, one that people in the neighborhood had heard before, but not always believed. Some saw him as a cautionary tale, a man who had it all and lost it all because of his insatiable hunger for power. Others, however, saw him differently. They admired his effort to turn around, to give back after so many years of destruction. They saw him as someone who had made the mistakes, lived the life, and was now trying to make amends. But no matter how much he tried to do good, Frank couldn't outrun his legacy. His name was still spoken in hushed tones, a shadow over the new generation. Some saw the man who had flooded the streets with heroin, who had brought suffering to families, and who had done things that were unforgivable. Others remembered the time when he had built soccer fields, funded schools, and provided for a community that had been overlooked for too long. Frank spent his days battling the contradictions of his existence. He connected with people who saw the good in him, people who were willing to look past the crimes, who understood that redemption was a slow process, a fight against years of damage. But he also faced those who refused to forgive him, who still viewed him as the villain, the man responsible for the pain and loss that had haunted so many lives. Each day, Frank walked the tightrope of reinvention, trying to rebuild his reputation in a world that would always remember him as the kingpin. The man he had been would forever be linked to the man he was now, no matter how much time had passed. And as much as he wanted to escape his past, he knew that the choices he made had defined him, had shaped the life he now tried to lead. No matter how many good deeds he performed, the weight of his former life was something he would carry forever. Frank sat in the darkened theater, surrounded by strangers who had no idea who he was. The screen flickered, and there it was, his life, laid bare before an audience. The actors didn't quite look like him, but the mannerisms, the way they carried themselves, that was familiar. He watched scenes unfold, dramatized versions of the deals he made, the power he held, the chaos that followed in his wake. As the movie played out, Frank couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and discomfort. On one hand, the portrayal fueled his legend. People would see this, would remember his name. His story would be immortalized, told over and over again. He would remain a figure larger than life, a man who had conquered the streets only to be brought down by the very system he had defied. But on the other hand, there was something off about it. The truth, his truth, had been bent, twisted into something more cinematic, more dramatic than what had actually happened. They made him into a myth, something he wasn't. They had reduced him to a symbol of crime, power, and greed, and that didn't sit right with him. The movie, the documentaries, the stories, the way people spoke about him, whether in admiration or in condemnation, it all felt like a mask. People either idolized him or demonized him. Some viewed him as a hero of the streets, a man who defied the odds, while others saw him as a monster, the root of all the suffering he had caused. But in the end, it didn't matter. Both views stripped him of his humanity. They didn't see Frank Lucas, the man who came from nothing, who fought every day to survive, who once had a family he loved and lost it all. They saw only the myth, the story of a kingpin who rose from the gutter to the top, only to fall hard, like a modern-day tragedy. He had built the empire, made the deals, fought the battles, but now his legacy was out of his hands. The world would remember the figure, the legend, but not the man who had lived, breathed, and struggled in the shadows. They didn't see the toll it had taken on him, the endless paranoia, the guilt, the constant fear of losing everything. No, that part of the story was lost, buried beneath the shiny surface of the myth. As the credits rolled, Frank stood up, the weight of it all pressing on him. The story was no longer his to control. It was something bigger, something beyond his reach. His name, his life, had become a part of pop culture, a cautionary tale told for generations to come. It didn't matter what he wanted people to remember. The myth would live on long after he was gone, and there was nothing he could do to change it. Frank spent most of his days in isolation, the silence heavy around him. The world outside seemed to move on without him, but inside his small, dimly lit home, time had slowed. His body was breaking down, the weight of his past now evident in every ache and every breath. The once powerful frame that had commanded respect in the streets was now frail, weighed down by years of stress, poor choices, and age. The depression hit him hardest at night. Insomnia kept him awake, his mind racing with thoughts he could no longer outrun. He had spent so many years living in the shadows, making deals and decisions that changed lives forever. But now those decisions echoed loudly in his head. The lives he'd taken, the families destroyed, the addiction he had helped spread, it all haunted him. There were nights when the silence was deafening, and he couldn't escape the memories, no matter how hard he tried. Frank had always been a man of action, of control. But now, it felt as though everything he had built, every empire, every connection, every last ounce of power was slipping through his fingers. His health was deteriorating, and it wasn't just physical. The psychological toll was immense, too. His past was a storm that never ceased to rage inside him. He was no longer the man who once commanded respect from all corners of the city. He was a man alone, broken by the very choices that had made him invincible. His reflection in the mirror only reminded him of what he had lost. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his once sharp features now soft, worn down by years of regret and guilt. The man who had once been larger than life had become a ghost of his former self. His mind wandered back to those early days, the hunger to rise above poverty, the desire to be something more. He had achieved everything he wanted, but now it all seemed meaningless. There was a point, late one evening, when Frank sat alone in his chair, staring at the wall, his fingers trembling as he held the glass of whiskey. His eyes traced the lines in his hands, lines that had once held the lives of so many in his grasp. He realized then just how fleeting it had all been. His empire had crumbled, his family had fallen apart, and the respect he had fought for had turned into fear, resentment, and ultimately, indifference. He thought about the end, about the price of everything he had done. He had spent so many years chasing power and wealth, but now, in his solitude, he understood the true cost of his silence. He had sacrificed his soul, and now he was left with nothing but the weight of his own choices. It wasn't a life he could take back, and the remorse was eating away at him. He had built an empire, but in the end, it was his own heart that had become the prison. The meeting was small, only a handful of faces Frank recognized, but they were enough to remind him of a time when he had controlled everything. Sitting in a quiet, dimly lit room, the echoes of their past filled the space. Laughs, stories, the sounds of power and money, the endless nights of strategy and success. The men who had once been his most trusted lieutenants, his brothers, had lived through it all with him. But now, years later, they had drifted. Some were out of the game, trying to move on, to forget the life that had once defined them. Others still carried the weight of their pasts, though the shine of their former glory had long since faded. They spoke like old friends, catching up on what had happened in the years since the fall. It wasn't just a reunion, it was a reckoning. They shared stories of the good times, the lavish parties, the women, the thrill of being untouchable, but also the bad, the betrayals, the fear, the losses. They all knew what they had done, what they had been a part of, and the destruction they had left in their wake. For a moment, it was as if they were back there, in their prime, running the streets of Harlem, where nothing was impossible and no one could touch them. Frank listened quietly, reflecting on the brotherhood they had once shared. They had been a family, a unit bound by loyalty and ambition. Back then, they had fought for control, built an empire that stretched beyond Harlem, and reveled in the power that came with it. But now they were ghosts of that life, each man grappling with the consequences of their actions, trying to figure out where they fit into a world that no longer wanted them. The regrets were there, unspoken but understood. One of his former associates, now living a quieter life, spoke about how much had changed in the world, how the streets weren't what they used to be. Frank could hear the longing in his voice, the nostalgia for the life they had led, but it was a nostalgia tinged with bitterness. Those days were gone, and no matter how hard they tried to recapture them, they would never return. For a brief moment, Frank felt the pull of that past again, the sense of power, the thrill of having it all. But it was fleeting. As the conversation went on, he couldn't ignore the fact that the bonds they had shared were broken, irreparable. Time and betrayal had changed them all. They had been family once, but now they were strangers, bound by nothing more than memories. As the night drew to a close, Frank stood to leave, his mind heavy with the weight of everything they had lost. He realized then that the life he had built, the empire, the relationships, it was all gone. The nostalgia faded quickly, replaced by the painful truth. They could never return to what they had. The past was a ghost, and it was time to let it go. Frank sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of his past pressing down on him like an unshakable burden. The news had come like a cold wind, a reminder that no matter how far he ran, the law would eventually catch up. New charges had been filed, another round of accusations to add to the pile of crimes that had followed him for years. This time, the government wasn't playing around. The past had come back to haunt him, and there was nowhere left to hide. He knew the drill. He had danced around the law for years, using his street smarts and his network of contacts to evade capture, to stay one step ahead. But this time felt different. The authorities were relentless. The surveillance, the wiretaps, the informants, everything had been carefully orchestrated to bring him down. For the first time, Frank couldn't find a way out. He had nowhere to turn. He thought about the days when he had been untouchable, when he ruled Harlem and felt invincible. The drugs, the money, the power, they had all come so easily to him. But now, all of it felt like a distant memory. He had spent years running, outsmarting the system, but the truth was, no one could outrun the consequences forever. The justice system was methodical, patient, and it had finally caught up with him. As the days passed and the net tightened around him, Frank found himself reflecting on his choices. The empire he had built, the life he had lived, had all been built on lies, manipulation, and violence. He had justified it all, telling himself he was a businessman, a man who did what was necessary to survive. But now, with the law closing in on him, the reality of his actions was inescapable. The lives he had ruined, the people he had hurt, the destruction he had left in his wake, it all came flooding back. There was no denying it anymore. Frank's attempts to evade capture were futile. The people who had once helped him were gone, either in prison or too far gone themselves to be of any use. The authorities were everywhere, watching his every move, waiting for him to slip up. And slip up, he did. The walls were closing in, and Frank knew there was no escape. As the moment of reckoning approached, Frank sat alone in his small apartment, waiting for the inevitable. He had faced down enemies, rivals, and even death itself, but this felt different. This time, he couldn't outsmart his way out. There was no trick, no deal that would save him now. The finality of it all hung in the air like a thick fog. When the authorities arrived to arrest him, Frank didn't fight. He didn't run. He stood there, resigned to the consequences of his actions. It was the end of the road, and he knew it. He had lived a life defined by choices that had brought him both power and pain. Now, he would face the reckoning. The empire he had built was gone, and the man who had ruled it was finally paying the price. Frank sat in the sterile, dimly lit room, his thoughts swirling like the dust motes drifting through the air. It was a moment of reckoning, the final test of everything he had tried to run from, and now, here it was, sitting before him in the quiet weight of his solitude. Redemption or surrender? Which road would he take? The weight of his past bore down on him, suffocating and relentless, a burden too heavy to escape. He had spent his entire life building an empire on lies, manipulation, and violence, and now, in his final hours, he was being asked to choose. The faces of his children danced behind his closed eyelids. His eldest son, the one who had watched from the shadows, hurt and confused, growing up without a father's guidance, always knowing more about his father's criminal empire than he ever wanted to. Frank's relationship with them had been fractured beyond repair. Decades of absence and regret had done that. He could still hear the anger in his son's voice, the sharp words that cut through him like a blade. And yet, amidst the fractured relationship, there was a small flicker of hope that somehow, in this moment of crisis, he could redeem himself in their eyes. But could he really make amends for all the wrongs he had done? Could any amount of good deeds or apologies undo the damage? Frank's mind fought against the concept of redemption. It seemed too easy, too neat a solution to a life so tangled in crime. Every life he had ruined, the families torn apart, the addiction he had fueled, the bloodshed it weighed heavily on his conscience. There was no going back. No amount of remorse would erase those sins, no matter how much he wished it were so. The clock ticked in his mind, but there was no escaping the past. As he sat there, battling his own thoughts, a decision began to take form, one born not out of guilt alone, but from a yearning to somehow make things right. There was no illusion of grandeur left, no desire to win the game. Frank knew, deep down, that the only path forward was through honesty, through confronting the destruction he had caused. His empire, the wealth, the power, it meant nothing now. It had all been for naught. The people he had hurt, the lives he had taken, that was what remained. He picked up the phone. The decision had been made. He would go to them, he would face the truth, and admit the guilt that had long lingered beneath his surface. No more lies, no more hiding. Frank would surrender, but not to the system that had always hunted him. This time, he would surrender to the truth, and to the possibility of redemption, however distant. His decision to cooperate, to provide the authorities with what they wanted in exchange for leniency, it was not just about securing a lighter sentence. It was about stepping into the light, accepting responsibility for the empire he had built and for the man he had become. Frank Lucas, once untouchable, was choosing to face his demons, to seek forgiveness, not for himself, but for those he had hurt along the way. Frank sat quietly in the dim light of his room, the passing days blending into one another. His body had aged far beyond its years, and the years of violence, power, and regret had left their mark. He often found himself staring at the cracked walls of his small space, the weight of time pressing down on him. His legacy, once something he held with pride and arrogance, now felt like a heavy cloak that had grown too tight to wear. He thought about Harlem, how it had been transformed under his rule, for better or worse. In those early days, he had believed his power would be unstoppable, that his influence would shape the very fabric of the city. He had built his empire on blood and fear, but somewhere along the way, it had also brought wealth, opportunity, and power to those who had nothing. He had given back to the community in his own way, constructing soccer fields, funding schools, and offering jobs to those who had nowhere else to turn. But with that generosity came destruction, the countless lives ruined by addiction, the violence that tore families apart, and the dark side of his empire that could never be erased. His reputation had become a double-edged sword. To some, he was a hero, a man who had given them hope and resources when the system had failed them. But to others, he was nothing more than a villain, a symbol of everything wrong with the streets. Frank knew he couldn't escape that duality. It was too ingrained, too deeply rooted in the fabric of who he had become. His name would live on, whispered in the streets, discussed in documentaries, and portrayed on screens. But who would remember him, the kingpin of Harlem, or the man who tried to build something out of nothing? Despite the distance he had put between himself and his old associates, some still came to visit, seeking his wisdom or, perhaps, his validation. They spoke of the past as if it were a distant dream of the days when the empire he had built was at its height. Frank listened, occasionally offering a few words of advice, but in the back of his mind, he knew they were looking for something more than answers. They were searching for the man he once was, the man they thought they had known. But that Frank was gone, lost in the maze of his own choices, and no amount of reflection could bring him back. He often thought about what could have been, about the possibility of redemption he had fleetingly grasped at. But as time wore on, he knew the truth: he was too far gone to truly change. The damage was done, and the consequences would follow him to the end. Yet, in the quiet of his solitude, there remained a faint hope that his story would serve as a lesson, a cautionary tale for those who would come after him. That perhaps, in the end, his life would not be defined solely by the terror he brought to the streets, but by the understanding that no empire, no matter how grand, comes without its cost. And so, with a heavy heart and a weary soul, Frank came to terms with who he was. His legacy was set, no longer something he could manipulate or control. The chapter of his life that had once burned so brightly was now closing, leaving behind only the memory of what he had been: a man who had everything, yet nothing at all. Frank sat in the dimly lit corner of his small apartment, the walls closing in on him as he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. The quiet of the room was suffocating, just as the weight of his past had been suffocating him for years. He could feel the years catching up to him both physically and mentally. His health had begun to betray him, his body a reflection of the life he had lived. His hands, once strong and steady, now trembled involuntarily, a constant reminder of the damage done. His back ached, and the sharp pangs in his chest no longer came from stress, but from a deeper, more pervasive rot that seemed to settle into his very bones. He could no longer sleep through the night. The memories, the guilt, the endless parade of faces and regrets would wake him in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. His mind wouldn't allow him rest. Insomnia had become a constant companion, and with it, the depression that had snuck up on him like a slow, creeping tide. There were days when it felt as though the weight of all his actions, the violence, the lives destroyed, the bloodshed was more than his body could carry. It was inescapable, the ache in his chest a constant reminder of all the choices he had made. The years of being a kingpin, of watching people fear him, had taken their toll in ways he couldn't have predicted. The reputation that had once served as his shield now felt like a shackle, binding him to a past he couldn't outrun. He had spent so long building an empire with ruthless ambition, only to realize that in doing so, he had destroyed the very thing he had wanted to protect: his peace of mind. As Frank sat there, the silence engulfing him, he couldn't help but think about his mortality. There was no one left to answer to, no empire to rule, no wealth to flaunt. What had it all been for? He had walked away from the streets, but the streets hadn't walked away from him. His past lingered in every shadow, in every quiet moment when he found himself alone with his thoughts. He was haunted by the faces of those he had hurt, by the fear in their eyes, the lives he had shattered without a second thought. The reflection came slowly, almost reluctantly, but it was there. Frank could no longer ignore the consequences of his choices. He had been a man who thrived on control, who lived by the belief that power could shield him from the weight of his actions. But now, in the solitude of his apartment, it was clear that nothing could shield him from the truth. No amount of money, no empire, no reputation could erase the damage he had done. The toll was heavy, and it had finally caught up with him. The phone call came unexpectedly, a number Frank hadn't seen in years. The voice on the other end was rough, seasoned with time, but still unmistakable. It was one of the old associates, a man who had once been at Frank's side, orchestrating the trade in the shadows of Harlem. He sounded different now, tired, worn down by the years that had passed since the empire crumbled. After some hesitant words, the plan was made. They would meet. Frank sat in the same old corner booth of a diner that had become a quiet sanctuary for those who had slipped into the cracks of society. The restaurant was more run down now, the walls faded, and the windows too dusty to reveal much of the world outside. It was fitting. The world had moved on. But Frank and his old friends still clung to these remnants, symbols of the past they couldn't let go of. The door creaked open, and the familiar face appeared. There was a brief moment of surprise in his eyes, but it quickly faded into a mask of resignation. The years had done their damage. They sat across from each other, both older, both weathered by the consequences of their choices. There was a silence between them at first, not awkward, but heavy with the weight of time that had passed. Slowly, the words began to spill out. They reminisced about the good old days when they ruled Harlem, when fear and respect went hand in hand. There was a sort of dark pride in those stories, but also a quiet acknowledgement of the destruction they had left in their wake. The bloodshed, the lives destroyed, the families torn apart. It wasn't all glory, not by a long shot, but it was their story. Frank could hear the regret in the way his old associate spoke. The edges of his voice had softened, replaced by the weary realization that the world they had once controlled was now a distant memory. They were no longer kings, just men trying to make sense of the wreckage. Frank's thoughts wandered to his own losses, the relationships broken, the bridges burned. He had spent so much time building something that would last forever, but it was all gone. The empire, the respect, the power, everything was lost in the end. They sat in silence for a while longer, the conversation turning less about the past and more about the present. Both of them were living in the wake of the choices they had made, each one trying to carve out some semblance of normalcy. But it was impossible. The damage had already been done. They would never return to what they had been. Frank finally broke the silence, his voice heavy with the realization. "We were a family, once," he said, "but those days are gone." His old associate nodded, looking out the window, as if waiting for a world that had long passed him by. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder each day, a constant reminder that the past never truly stays buried. Frank had spent years running, evading the relentless grip of law enforcement. But now the chase had caught up with him. New charges were filed, more accusations stacking up like an endless pile of debt he could never repay. Frank knew the end was near. The weight of his past actions, once so distant and abstract, now felt like a suffocating blanket. The law had been patient, watching, waiting, and now, it seemed, it was finally closing in on him. Frank had thought that the worst was behind him after all. Hadn't he survived the worst of it already? He'd been through the raids, the betrayals, the arrests. He'd lived through it all, thinking the power he once commanded could keep him safe. But now, the game had changed. Law enforcement was smarter, faster, and their reach seemed endless. Frank tried to lay low, to disappear into the shadows he once thrived in, but it was clear now those shadows no longer held him. He thought about his life, the choices that had led him here, the man he had become, the empire he'd built, and the destruction that came with it. It all seemed so far removed from the boy who once dreamed of something better. For so long, Frank had believed he could outrun the law, outsmart the people who chased him. But now, sitting in his small, dimly lit apartment, he realized that he had done just that, outrun the truth for far too long. It wasn't that the law was quicker now. It was that he had finally caught up to himself. As the weeks passed, the pressure mounted. Frank couldn't escape the feeling that every corner he turned brought him closer to the inevitable. He could sense the tightening noose, the tightening of the lives that had once been under his control. His mind would race, searching for an escape, for a way out of the trap he had set for himself. But the reality was sinking in. There was no way out. The authorities were relentless, and now that they had him in their sights, there was no avoiding it. The quiet confidence Frank had once held began to fade. His thoughts shifted from survival to responsibility. Was there any way to make peace with the consequences, or was he doomed to face them with nothing left? The finality of it all hit him like a freight train. He had evaded them for so long, but now the truth was undeniable. He had to face the consequences of his choices, the ones he had tried to outrun for years. As he prepared himself for the inevitable, Frank's mind wandered back to the people he had hurt, his family, his community, the lies and the damage he had caused. He would never escape the weight of those decisions, but perhaps now, in facing them, he could begin to accept the reality of the man he had become. The consequences were coming, and there was nowhere left to hide. Frank sat in the small, quiet room, the weight of his past pressing on him like an anchor. The decision was in front of him, as clear as the scars on his soul. He could continue running, continue hiding in the shadows of his former life, or he could face the truth, redemption, or surrender. The two paths seemed equally heavy, each one holding its own promise of peace but also its own toll. Could he ever truly redeem himself for the damage he had caused? Or had his choices, the lives he'd ruined, the people he'd hurt, taken him past the point of no return? The thought of his children haunted him. His relationship with them had always been distant, strained by the choices he'd made. They were growing up without him, left to navigate their lives with the shadow of his name hanging over them. What kind of father had he been? What kind of man? Frank had spent years convincing himself that his empire, his power, had been worth the sacrifices. But now, sitting here, with nothing left but the remnants of his past, he couldn't help but question whether it had all been worth it. He thought of the people he had hurt along the way, the families torn apart by addiction, the friends he betrayed, the lives lost in the wake of his rise to power. No amount of money, no amount of control over Harlem could erase that. Frank had always believed he could carve out his place in the world, that he could shape his own destiny. But now, as he sat facing the consequences, he understood that destiny had its own way of unfolding, and it didn't always play by the rules. Redemption, the word echoed in his mind. Could he ever truly atone for the things he had done? Could he make peace with the people he had wronged, especially when he knew that no amount of good deeds would undo the damage he had caused? It was a question he had avoided for years, but now it was the only one that mattered. He had lived in the shadows for too long, hiding behind the walls he'd built, walls of power, walls of fear. But now, there was no escaping it. The decision came down to this. Could he continue to run, to fight for the scraps of a life he no longer wanted? Or could he face the music, accept his guilt, and begin to rebuild what little of his humanity was left? In a moment of clarity, Frank made his choice. He would cooperate with the authorities, face the truth, and admit his guilt. The deal with them wouldn't undo the damage, but it would be his first step towards something resembling redemption. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, but as he made the decision, he realized that this was the only chance he had left to finally come to terms with who he was and who he might still be. Frank sat alone, his mind wandering through the tangled web of his past. Time had a way of dulling the sharp edges of memories, but the weight of his decisions remained as heavy as ever. The empire he built, the power he wielded, and the pain he caused were all pieces of a life he could never truly escape. He had been both the hero and the villain, depending on who was telling the story. In Harlem, he was a legend, but a legend of contradictions, a man who had lifted his community while simultaneously breaking it apart. The streets that once feared him now whispered his name with a mixture of respect and resentment. His name had become synonymous with both success and destruction. He had been the king of Harlem, but at what cost? As he sat in the silence, former associates visited him. They were no longer the young men who once looked up to him, but men who had aged in ways that reflected the toll the life of crime had taken on them. They came seeking wisdom, advice, an odd thing for a man who had spent years hiding his sins. They wanted to know what he thought, what he would do if he could go back. Frank had no answers for them. His story, he realized, wasn't one to be replicated, but one to be learned from. The mistakes, the choices, the betrayals they had led him here, to this moment, and no amount of reflection would change that. He thought about the families torn apart by his empire, the lives lost in the battles fought on his behalf, and the countless others left behind in the wake of his rise and fall. Frank had built something magnificent, but it had crumbled just as quickly. He couldn't undo the damage. He had been too far gone to truly change, too entrenched in the life he had chosen. Redemption, he had realized, wasn't for men like him. But even so, there was a small part of him that hoped his story could serve as a lesson for those who would come after him, a lesson about the dangers of ambition, about the cost of power, and about the consequences of living a life without limits. As the days passed, Frank understood that his legacy would never be one of simple victory. He had been too much of both a villain and a hero in the eyes of those who remembered him. In the quiet moments, Frank wondered if his story had any meaning beyond the pain it had caused. It was too late for him to find peace with the past, but perhaps, just perhaps, others could learn from it. He had made his choices, and now he would live with them. The story of Frank Lucas would live on, not as a tale of glory, but as a warning. Frank Lucas spent his final days in a solitude that mirrored the isolation he had always feared. Whether confined to a small, dreary cell in prison, or secluded in the quiet emptiness of his own home, the once mighty kingpin found himself alone with only his conscience and the weight of his past actions. Time had softened him, but it had also made him painfully aware of the consequences of the empire he had built. His once thriving heroin network, which had stretched across cities and bound countless lives in chains, was now nothing more than a memory. In the twilight of his life, Frank was left to sift through the wreckage he had created. The lavish wealth, the power, the influence, everything had come at a price. He had touched the lives of many, some of whom had risen with him, only to fall as quickly as they had climbed. And then there were the countless others, the nameless faces, whose lives had been forever altered by the heroin he had flooded into the streets. Frank had built an empire on their suffering. In his final moments, Frank sought to make peace with what he could. He reached out to his family, to the ones he had hurt most deeply, the wife and children who had been left behind in his relentless pursuit of power. There were moments of reconciliation, of seeking forgiveness for the years of neglect, for the mistakes that could never be undone. His health had declined steadily, a direct result of years of excess, violence, and stress. The once strong and calculating man had become frail, his body worn by a lifetime of fighting, both physically and morally. Yet, in these last days, it was not the physical pain that dominated him. It was the mental and emotional toll. Frank was forced to confront the man he had become, the consequences of his decisions, and the harsh reality that redemption might forever remain out of his grasp. His thoughts often drifted back to the decisions that had shaped his life, the choices that had led him from a boy in the South to a feared and powerful figure in Harlem. He thought of his empire, its rise and its inevitable downfall. Would his legacy be remembered as that of a man who had built something from nothing, or as a man who had lost everything, including his humanity, in the process? There were no answers, only the gnawing realization that his story was a tragedy. He had been a hero to some, a villain to others, and in the end, neither fully defined him. In these final days, Frank faced the ultimate truth. The life he had lived, the empire he had constructed was gone. His health was deteriorating, and with it, the hope for any form of redemption. The battles he had fought, both on the streets and within himself, had all been in vain. Now, all he could do was wait, trapped by the legacy of his own making, and face the reality that there was no way to escape the past that had defined him. Frank Lucas's death came quietly, a stark contrast to the turbulent life he had led. There was no grand spectacle to mark the end of a man who had once been the kingpin of Harlem's heroin trade, no flashing lights or media frenzy. Instead, it was a small, private affair. his funeral attended only by a handful of family members and a few old associates who had witnessed the rise and fall of his empire. It was a subdued moment, almost fitting for a man who had spent the final years of his life grappling with the consequences of his actions. The criminal underworld, which had once feared and revered Frank, reacted in varied ways. Some mourned his passing, remembering him as a man who had carved out his own piece of the American dream, even if that dream was built on the suffering of others. For them, Frank Lucas was a symbol of resilience, a figure who had risen from humble beginnings to rule the streets of New York with an iron fist. But there were others who saw his death as the inevitable conclusion to a life filled with betrayal, violence, and greed. They celebrated the end of a man who had once held so much power, but whose empire had ultimately crumbled beneath the weight of its own excess. Public reaction was similarly mixed. To some, Frank Lucas was a notorious criminal, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the drug trade. To others, he was a tragic figure, a product of his environment who had tried to do something meaningful for his family and his community, but had lost his way in the process. The complexities of his legacy were not lost on anyone, and in the wake of his death, discussions about his life were never simple. Was he a villain, a victim, or something in between? His passing marked the end of an era in the drug trade, signaling the slow but inevitable transition to a new world. The days of the old-school drug kingpins, who built empires with their own hands, were fading. The rise of corporate drug syndicates and law enforcement crackdowns had made the kind of operations Frank ran increasingly obsolete. Yet, despite the changes, his influence was undeniable. He had shaped the course of the drug trade in Harlem and beyond, leaving an indelible mark on the history of organized crime in America. Frank Lucas's death was an understated moment in history, one that might have passed unnoticed by many. But for those who lived through it, those who had seen the rise and fall of his empire, his story would never be forgotten. In death, as in life, Frank remained a figure of mythic proportions, a man whose legacy was as complicated as the choices that led him to the top. In the years following Frank Lucas's death, the ripples of his once mighty empire continued to reverberate throughout the drug trade and the communities that had been shaped by his actions. While his physical presence had faded, the legacy he left behind was impossible to ignore. The drug trade, particularly in Harlem, had evolved, but the shadow of Frank's rise and fall remained ever present. New players entered the game, but they found themselves contending with the ghost of a man who had once controlled everything. His influence continued to loom large, an unspoken reminder of the power that could be attained and lost in the brutal world he had once ruled. As time passed, Frank's story began to take on a life of its own in the form of documentaries, books, and films. The media turned Frank Lucas into a character larger than life, portraying him both as a criminal mastermind and a tragic figure. His rise from humble beginnings to the heights of power was fascinating, and his eventual downfall offered a cautionary tale of ambition gone wrong. These portrayals, however, were never entirely accurate. They simplified the complexities of Frank's character, glossing over the pain and destruction he had caused in the pursuit of wealth and power. To some, he was a hero, a self-made man who had played by his own rules. To others, he was a villain, a figure who had profited from human suffering and perpetuated a cycle of violence that had scarred so many lives. Frank's family, particularly his children, found themselves thrust into the public eye as the legacy of their father's empire became the subject of endless discussion. His children carried the weight of their father's reputation, a burden that was both a gift and a curse. They were forced to navigate a world where their father was either revered or reviled, often forced to answer for the actions of a man who had been both a provider and a perpetrator of harm. As Frank's story continued to unfold in the media, his family became unwilling participants in the mythologizing process, with each new documentary or book casting them in a different light. Public discussions about Frank's life continued to evolve. His story was dissected and debated, viewed through multiple lenses, some admiring his resilience, others condemning his cruelty. As the years went on, his criminal past became the subject of moral questioning. Was he a product of his environment, a victim of his own ambition, or was he simply a man who made terrible choices that cost him everything? People from all walks of life continued to be fascinated by Frank's rise and fall, finding lessons in his life and applying them to their own struggles and triumphs. His story, with its contradictions and complexities, continued to spark debate, and in doing so, his legacy remained very much alive both as a symbol of success and as a stark reminder of the cost of power. Frank Lucas's empire, once built on the steady flow of heroin and the iron-fisted rule over Harlem's streets, had long since crumbled. The lavish homes, the fleets of cars, and the power that had once seemed so unshakable were now only remnants of a life that had spiraled out of control. Yet, the shadow of his influence lingered, casting a long and unsettling presence over both the criminal underworld and the broader public consciousness. His name remained synonymous with the rise and fall of a man who had defied the odds, only to be undone by his own ambition. The hippos, those absurd symbols of Frank's wealth, became a strange but lasting reminder of his eccentricity. Once confined to the private estate that had housed his wealth, these creatures, symbols of a life defined by excess, now roamed freely in the wild. They were an oddity, an anachronism, much like Frank himself, a man whose outsized ambitions and unrelenting pursuit of power seemed at times too outlandish to be real. Yet they existed, a living testament to the bizarre and luxurious world Frank had inhabited. Harlem, once the bustling center of Frank's drug empire, had transformed in ways Frank could never have imagined. Gentrification had taken root, reshaping the neighborhood into something unrecognizable, both to its longtime residents and to those who had once thrived in the shadows of his operations. The streets, once alive with the hustle and bustle of Frank's heroin trade, had been replaced with trendy shops and expensive condos. The very places that had witnessed the rise of his empire now stood as monuments to the changing tides of the city, a stark contrast to the world Frank had once ruled. As the old guard faded away, a new generation of criminals took the lessons Frank had taught them. They understood how to rise, how to wield power, and ultimately, how to fall. Frank had left behind more than just an empire of drugs and violence. He had crafted a blueprint for ambition, one that future generations would follow, even if it led them down the same tragic path. His story had become a cautionary tale, but one that would continue to echo through the halls of organized crime. In the end, Frank Lucas remained a symbol, a figure of both admiration and condemnation. He was a man who had achieved everything and lost it all. His legacy would never be simple, nor would it ever be fully understood. Was he a hero? A self-made man who had fought against the odds to build something greater? Or was he merely a villain, whose pursuit of power destroyed everything he touched? And in the end, did he ever find peace? Or was he forever chasing something he could never catch, a sense of fulfillment that had always been just out of reach? Frank's legacy lives on, not as a person, but as a haunting question that continues to resonate with those who remember him.